In a world where silence speaks louder than words, and loyalty is tested by betrayal, Lucky Luciano built an empire that would outlast him, shaping the underworld for generations. But what happens when a man's power is so great that even death can't silence his legacy? Lucky Luciano was born in 1897, in the heart of the chaos that was New York City at the time. His real name was Salvatore Lucania, but the world would come to know him as Lucky, a moniker that would become synonymous with power, crime, and ruthless ambition. Raised in the gritty, impoverished streets of East Harlem, Luciano's childhood was steeped in hardship. His family, like many Italian immigrants, lived in constant struggle, fighting to survive in a neighborhood where crime often felt like the only way out. His father, a fisherman, worked tirelessly to provide for his family, while his mother, a housewife, kept their modest home. Yet, the lure of the streets was too powerful for the young Luciano. By the time he was a teenager, he was already caught up in the world of petty crime, working as a street hustler, stealing watches, running small-time scams, and learning the rules of survival in a city that was built on them. Luciano wasn't a typical street kid. He wasn't wild, nor was he overly brash, but what set him apart was his sharp mind and an ability to see opportunities where others saw obstacles. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to rule. By his early 20s, Luciano was already associating with some of the most notorious figures in New York's underworld. His rise was swift, driven not just by his connections, but by his ability to outthink and outmaneuver everyone around him. It was during this time that Luciano crossed paths with a man who would forever change his life. Arnold Rothstein, the gambler and mastermind behind some of the most sophisticated criminal operations in America. Rothstein saw something in the young Luciano, a kind of ambition that he had once possessed, and he decided to take him under his wing. It was Rothstein who introduced Luciano to the world of high-level organized crime, and soon enough, Luciano's focus shifted from petty theft to more lucrative rackets, gambling, bootlegging, and eventually, heroin trafficking. But what set him apart from others was his vision. He wasn't content with running small-time operations. Luciano wanted to build something lasting, something that would endure for generations. By the early 1920s, Luciano was already making waves. His first real power play came when he helped orchestrate the assassination of his boss, Joe, the Boss, Masseria, in a bloody power struggle over control of the Genovese crime family. It was a move that would cement Luciano's position at the top of the mafia hierarchy. With Masseria out of the way, Luciano quickly moved to consolidate power, forming alliances with rival families, creating a network that would dominate the city and eventually the entire country. But Luciano wasn't just a ruthless killer, he was also a master strategist. His understanding of business, of managing people, and of organizing crime into a well-oiled machine set him apart from every other mobster before him. He wasn't just interested in power for power's sake. He wanted control, structure, and influence on a scale that no one had ever imagined. Luciano's journey from a poor immigrant in New York to a criminal mastermind is a story carved from the hard, gritty streets of the early 20th century. Born into a family of immigrants, Luciano's childhood in the slums of East Harlem was a far cry from the American dream that others might have imagined for him. His family had little. His father was a fisherman, working long hours just to keep food on the table, and his mother kept a humble home. They arrived in America in search of opportunity, but the harsh reality of life in New York quickly became evident. The streets were filled with immigrants, struggling to make a living, often caught in a system that offered them few chances to rise above their station. From an early age, Luciano knew he wasn't going to make it by following the rules. He wasn't a kid who was satisfied with poverty or overlooked by the world around him. By the time he was a teenager, Luciano had already begun his descent into the world of crime. He started off small, stealing, hustling, and running scams, the same petty offenses that many in his neighborhood engaged in just to survive. But there was something different about Luciano. He was smart, calculating, and able to navigate the dangerous streets with a cool head that most others lacked. He wasn't just in it for the quick thrill. Luciano had a bigger vision, one that extended far beyond street-level crime. It wasn't long before he caught the eye of people higher up in the criminal world. His ability to connect with people and his sharp business sense made him an asset. Luciano's early involvement in the criminal underworld was shaped by his partnerships with people like Arnold Rothstein, a gambling mogul who recognized the potential in the young immigrant. Rothstein's mentorship would prove pivotal in Luciano's rise, teaching him not just the art of crime, but also the importance of thinking like a businessman. This wasn't just about power for power's sake. This was about building something bigger, something that would last. Luciano quickly began to move beyond petty crime. His focus shifted to bootlegging, gambling, and the heroin trade. But his true genius was in organizing. He wasn't interested in a chaotic, scattered operation like many of his predecessors. Luciano wanted structure, efficiency, and control. He set the groundwork for what would become a network of alliances that spanned across the entire criminal landscape. But he knew he couldn't just rely on his criminal activity. He had to embed himself in the fabric of New York's power structure, something that was going to take both charm and cunning. By the late 1920s, Luciano was no longer just a poor immigrant. He had become a force in the criminal world, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the streets of East Harlem. What started as small-time hustles had turned into a calculated empire, one that would forever change the face of organized crime. But to Luciano, this was just the beginning. The world was his to take, and he wasn't about to let anyone or anything stand in his way. Lucky Luciano's early years on the streets of Lower Manhattan were nothing short of a proving ground for his future as a criminal mastermind. The streets, crowded and chaotic, were a microcosm of the broader world of organized crime, a world that Luciano would soon conquer. Lower Manhattan, home to many Italian immigrants, was a melting pot of ambition, struggle, and opportunity, but also a breeding ground for lawlessness. Here, Luciano's raw potential began to take shape, and he started to learn the delicate art of survival and power. At just 14 years old, Luciano was already rubbing elbows with some of the most notorious figures in the city's underworld. He was no stranger to street hustles, petty crimes, and low-level scams. But it was in this dense maze of narrow streets, lined with taverns and corner shops, that Luciano discovered the true nature of organized crime. The mafia wasn't just about violence or theft, it was about loyalty, strategy, and, above all, control. And Luciano, keenly aware of his surroundings, began to see it all as a business. It wasn't long before he became known in the neighborhood, not for being the biggest or toughest, but for being the most intelligent. He learned the unspoken rules of the street, the alliances and betrayals that wove through the criminal world like an intricate web. By the time he was 20, Luciano had developed an uncanny ability to read people, a skill that would become invaluable in his climb up the ranks of organized crime. It was here, in the back rooms of speakeasies and the alleyways behind crowded bars, that he honed his capacity for negotiation, for turning the tables, for making deals that would eventually shape the city's underworld. Luciano's first major connection came when he met a man named Meyer Lansky, a fellow Jewish immigrant who shared his vision of building a criminal empire. The two became fast friends and partners, with Lansky bringing a level of business acumen that complemented Luciano's street smarts. Together, they began to carve out a piece of the Manhattan underworld, setting up operations that ranged from gambling to bootlegging, navigating the shifting allegiances between various ethnic crime families. But it wasn't just about making money, it was about positioning oneself at the top of the criminal hierarchy. As Luciano became more involved with these powerful figures, he learned to manipulate the power structures around him, leveraging influence over the police, politicians, and even judges. Lower Manhattan was a place where criminal empires were built on whispers, favors, and the threat of violence. But Luciano, with his growing reputation and strategic thinking, began to see the bigger picture. He knew that the key to lasting power wasn't just in winning battles, it was in controlling the entire game. By the time Luciano reached his mid-20s, he wasn't just a street hustler anymore. He had become a force in the streets of Lower Manhattan, a man who understood both the rules and the consequences of breaking them. This was his foundation, the place where he learned that in this world, survival was about much more than staying alive. It was about becoming untouchable. Luciano's first real break into the world of rackets came at a time when the streets of New York were ripe with opportunity for anyone willing to take risks. At the age of 18, Luciano wasn't just another face on the block anymore. He had the connections, the reputation, and most importantly, the mind for business. His early years were spent learning the ropes of petty crimes, but the moment he stepped into the world of organized rackets, everything changed. He started small, working alongside seasoned hustlers, running numbers, and participating in street-level gambling operations. These were the kind of rackets that ran on the edges of the law, where a slip-up meant more than just a busted operation, it could mean a trip to the morgue. But for Luciano, these stakes were exactly what he was looking for. He was no longer content with being a small-time thief. He wanted control, power, and a piece of the action that stretched from Manhattan to every corner of the city. His first true break came when he began working with Meyer Lansky and Charlie Lucky. Luciano's rising star began to shine brighter. Together, they navigated the dangerous waters of bootlegging, rackets that brought in substantial revenue, but also attracted law enforcement and rival gangs. But Luciano had a knack for staying one step ahead. He wasn't just about making money, he understood the importance of building networks, controlling territories, and securing loyalty from those who worked under him. The world of rackets wasn't just about muscle, it was about strategy, about understanding how to manipulate the system, and Luciano was a quick study. It wasn't long before Luciano became a trusted figure in the criminal world. He was able to leverage his street smarts, forming alliances with other crime families, establishing a foundation that would set him up for the future. His operation grew, taking on larger and more profitable rackets, including extortion and gambling. But even with his growing success, Luciano never lost touch with the street-level hustle that had first drawn him in. He understood that the key to success wasn't just the business, it was the people. He was calculating, but also knew how to keep his hands clean. He was a man of connections, able to navigate the inner workings of the criminal world with ease. Luciano's transformation from a small-time hustler to a major player was marked by his ability to adapt. He was always looking for the next big thing, the next racket that could make him richer and more powerful. As his empire grew, so did his ability to manage and organize people, turning disjointed criminal activities into a well-oiled machine. The making of a mobster wasn't just about earning money. It was about building something bigger, something that would last far beyond the chaos of the streets. And Luciano, already seeing the bigger picture, began to build. Luciano's transformation into a true power player in the world of organized crime was not a matter of simple ambition. It was the result of a carefully executed strategy that saw him rise above the chaos of street-level hustles and into the world of real power. By the early 1930s, Luciano had cemented his position as one of the most influential figures in the New York underworld, but he knew that true power could only be achieved by controlling more than just the streets. He needed to bring order to the chaos, structure to the disorder, and that's where the idea for the commission was born. In 1931, Luciano saw that the old methods of running rackets, where every crime family was a loose, isolated entity were not only outdated but also dangerously inefficient. Rivalries between families were erupting into open warfare, tearing apart the stability of the criminal empire Luciano had worked so hard to build. What Luciano realized was that in order to take the next step, he would need to establish a central authority that could mediate disputes, ensure fair profit distribution, and ultimately create a system that would benefit all the major families involved. He was thinking long-term. Luciano's vision was bold, a governing body that could control organized crime not just in New York, but across the entire country. He brought together the heads of the nation's most influential crime families, the Genovese, the Gambino, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and others into what would become known as the Commission. This was the brainchild of Luciano, a man who saw the opportunity to unify and organize, rather than divide and conquer. The Commission would serve as the final word in any dispute between families, with Luciano positioned as the central figure, the arbiter, the man who could keep the peace while making sure everyone got their cut of the action. The establishment of the Commission marked a shift in the way organized crime would operate. No longer would families fight for turf or engage in bloody feuds over petty disputes. Instead, they would sit at the table together, making decisions for the greater good of their collective power. Luciano, always the visionary, understood that if the criminal world could function as a unified front, it could operate more smoothly and, most importantly, more profitably. Under this system, rival families were able to coexist and even collaborate. Knowing that there was a neutral body to resolve conflicts, Luciano's role in the Commission solidified his status as the kingpin of organized crime, not just in New York, but throughout the United States. By establishing this governing body, he had effectively created a criminal empire that was more sophisticated and structured than anything the world had ever seen. The Commission was not just a reflection of Luciano's business acumen. It was a manifestation of his understanding of power and his ability to wield it with precision. It was the ultimate symbol of Luciano's rise to the top of the criminal world and the beginning of a new era for organized crime. Luciano's ascent to power was not a solo effort. While he was undeniably the mastermind behind the Commission and the organized structure of American organized crime, it was the relationships he built with other powerful mob figures that solidified his reign. Among these relationships, none would be more crucial to Luciano's long-term dominance than his alliance with Carlo Gambino, a man who would come to be one of the most influential figures in the history of the American Mafia. Luciano first crossed paths with Gambino in the 1930s, a time when Gambino was still rising through the ranks of the Castellano crime family. Gambino, who was born in Sicily and had moved to the United States as a young man, had the quiet demeanor and sharp mind that would make him a perfect ally for Luciano. Unlike many of the loud, confrontational figures in the world of organized crime, Gambino was reserved, preferring to keep his cards close to his chest. This made him an excellent partner for Luciano, whose ambitions required a level of discretion and strategic thinking that few others in the mob could match. The bond between Luciano and Gambino was built on mutual respect, but it was also rooted in shared goals. Luciano saw in Gambino a man who could operate with the same level of precision and intelligence that he himself used to run the criminal empire. Gambino, on the other hand, admired Luciano's ability to unite the fractured crime families, and knew that aligning with him would provide not only security, but also a massive opportunity for growth. Their partnership was more than just about power. It was a partnership of vision, of understanding how to expand the reach of the mafia while maintaining an organized and controlled environment. As Luciano's power grew, so did his relationship with Gambino. Luciano recognized the potential in Gambino and made sure to elevate him within the Commission's hierarchy. Gambino was put in charge of overseeing many of the operations in Brooklyn, one of the most lucrative areas for the mafia. With Gambino running the Brooklyn rackets, Luciano knew he had a man who could be trusted to make the right decisions and keep everything running smoothly. Gambino's quiet yet authoritative approach to crime made him one of Luciano's most valuable allies, and as their relationship strengthened, so did their influence over the New York Mafia. However, as Luciano's empire grew, so did the tension between different factions within the mob. The Genovese family, once loyal to Luciano, began to show signs of discontent, and power struggles loomed. It was in these turbulent times that Gambino's importance would truly shine. As Luciano dealt with these internal power struggles, Gambino's role in the commission became even more crucial. He was a steady hand, someone who could be relied upon to mediate disputes and ensure that the balance of power remained intact. The alliance between Luciano and Gambino was not just based on shared business. It was based on trust, loyalty, and an understanding of what was at stake. For Luciano, Gambino was not just an ally. He was a cornerstone of the future of the Mafia. And for Gambino, Luciano was the man who helped him rise to the heights of power, positioning him for what would eventually become his own dominance within the crime world. Together, they represented a formidable force in the world of organized crime, a partnership that would shape the direction of the Mafia for decades to come. The Roaring Twenties brought with it a period of unprecedented opportunity for men like Lucky Luciano. While the United States was reveling in the era's excesses, flappers, jazz, and the shimmering lights of New York's nightlife, there was one dark undercurrent driving the city's prosperity: alcohol. Prohibition had been enacted in 1920, making the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol illegal. For most, this was a devastating blow to the bar industry, but for men like Luciano, it was the spark that would ignite their criminal empire into a new level of wealth and power. At the heart of this shift was bootlegging, the act of illegally importing, distilling, and distributing alcohol became the lifeblood of organized crime, and Luciano was quick to seize on the opportunity. While many of the older mafia figures were set in their ways, running more traditional rackets, Luciano had a vision for how the criminal world could operate on a grander scale. He didn't just want to smuggle alcohol, he wanted to control it, from production to distribution, all across the United States. Luciano understood that the demand for liquor wasn't going away, no matter how strict the government became. The people wanted their alcohol, and they were willing to break the law to get it. Prohibition had created a black market where fortunes could be made, and Luciano, always the shrewd businessman, saw an opportunity to monopolize it. He established a network of distilleries, warehouses, and distribution points that stretched from Canada to the Caribbean, ensuring that he controlled the entire supply chain. He didn't rely on one source of income. He diversified, bringing in rum, whiskey, and gin, making sure to keep his competition at bay through a mix of violence, bribery, and loyalty. One of Luciano's greatest talents was his ability to forge alliances. The bootlegging business was a highly competitive one, and it didn't take long before rival gangs were fighting for control of the same territories. Luciano, however, recognized that a fragmented criminal world would lead to chaos and infighting, which ultimately hurt profits. So, instead of engaging in an all-out war with his competitors, he used the power of the commission to bring order to the situation. He brokered peace agreements and divided territories, ensuring that all the major crime families got a piece of the action while keeping the business running smoothly. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was no longer just a rising star in the underworld, he was the undisputed king of bootlegging in New York City. His influence had spread across the country, and his empire was built on a network of loyal soldiers, bribe-taking politicians, corrupt law enforcement, and most importantly, a reliable supply of alcohol. With the government unable to enforce prohibition effectively, Luciano's business grew into one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises in history. The Roaring Twenties, however, were just the beginning. Luciano knew that the Prohibition era wouldn't last forever. But during those years of flourishing chaos, He capitalized on the moment, using the immense wealth generated by bootlegging to lay the groundwork for an even bigger criminal empire. While many criminals relied on short-term profits, Luciano thought long-term, preparing for a future where he could expand into gambling, narcotics, and, most crucially, build a structure of organized crime that would stand the test of time. The bootlegging operations of the 1920s were the foundation of Luciano's rise, and prohibition allowed him to reshape the world of organized crime forever. In the world of organized crime, power was the most coveted prize, and it was never handed over easily. Luciano's rise to the top was not a smooth ascent. It was marked by violence, betrayal, and strategic maneuvering. As his influence grew, so did the number of rivals eager to take his place, each one hoping to wrest control of the lucrative criminal empire Luciano was building in New York. The battle for power was fought not just on the streets, but in back rooms, at quiet meetings, and in the hearts of the most influential crime families. Luciano's first real test came when he took on the established old guard of the five families, the Genovese, Gambino, Colombo, Lucchese, and Bonanno families who had long ruled New York's underworld. These families were deeply entrenched in the old ways of doing business, bound by tradition and reluctant to change. Luciano, however, was a visionary. He recognized that the fractured state of the criminal world, characterized by fragmented turf wars and lack of cooperation, was a barrier to his ambition. He wanted to build something bigger, something more organized, and something that would endure. His rivalry with other gangsters was not just personal, but ideological. While many of the older mobsters were content with their slice of the pie, Luciano aimed to control everything. The old guard resisted this shift. They saw Luciano's methods, his push for unity, his dealings with outsiders, and his desire to break with tradition as a threat. The street battles were brutal, with rival factions seeking to undermine Luciano at every turn. Murders, bombings, and betrayals became routine as Luciano fought to consolidate his power. But his brilliance lay in his ability to survive and adapt. While his enemies were stuck in the past, he was moving forward, forging alliances, and picking off his enemies one by one. One of the most significant moments in Luciano's battle for power came with his confrontation with the powerful boss Joe Masseria, head of the Genovese family. Masseria represented everything Luciano disliked about the old way of doing business. He was a loud, arrogant boss who believed in brute force and intimidation. Luciano, on the other hand, was calculating, measured, and far more willing to use diplomacy when it suited him. Tensions came to a head in 1931 when Luciano ordered Masseria's assassination, a move that shocked the criminal world. It wasn't just the murder that marked the shift in power, it was what followed. By eliminating Masseria, Luciano not only sent a message to his enemies but also gained control of the Genovese family's operations, further solidifying his hold over the city. But even after the fall of Masseria, the battles didn't end. Luciano still had to contend with Salvatore Maranzano, another powerful boss who sought to take Masseria's place. In another dramatic turn, Luciano orchestrated Maranzano's murder, securing his dominance once and for all. These bold moves, though violent, demonstrated his brilliance as a strategist. Luciano didn't just fight for power. He engineered his victories with an eye on the bigger picture, always thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. By the end of the 1930s, Luciano had successfully consolidated power in New York. He had outsmarted, outlasted, and outmaneuvered his rivals, rising above the chaos he had once been a part of. His victory didn't just make him a boss, it made him the boss, the architect of a new era of organized crime in America. The days of fragmented, disorganized crime families were over. In their place stood the Commission, a united body that controlled every aspect of the mafia in New York. And Luciano was the man behind it all, the undisputed king of the underworld. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano had built an empire in New York that was unmatched. His control over the city's 5 crime families had reshaped the underworld, but he wasn't content with just dominating the streets of one city. Luciano had a vision for something much bigger, something that would stretch across the entire country. He understood that in order to maintain power and grow his empire, he needed to unite the fragmented criminal operations that spanned the United States. This was the birth of the National Crime Syndicate. The idea behind the syndicate was simple yet revolutionary. Instead of each mafia family working independently, constantly fighting over turf and profits, Luciano saw an opportunity to organize crime on a national scale, ensuring stability and profit for all involved. He began reaching out to mob bosses across the country, from Chicago to Detroit, Los Angeles to New Orleans, forging alliances with the country's most powerful criminals. These weren't just any alliances. They were partnerships built on shared interests, mutual protection, and, above all, a common goal: control. The syndicate was a carefully constructed organization, a loose coalition of powerful figures who would work together to expand the reach of organized crime while maintaining their individual territories. Luciano, as the architect of this grand plan, used his influence and charisma to bring together figures like Meyer Lansky, Ben, Bugsy, Siegel, and other influential mob bosses, all of whom were pivotal in turning the syndicate from an idea into a reality. They came together not just for the immediate rewards, but for the long-term power it would provide them. By consolidating power, they could avoid the infighting that had plagued organized crime for decades and ensure a steady flow of profits from a wide variety of illegal activities, including bootlegging, gambling, and later, narcotics. What Luciano and his allies created was an unprecedented shift in how crime was organized. Instead of isolated family-run operations, the syndicate allowed for cooperation between criminal organizations across state lines. This new approach meant that crime was no longer a fragmented patchwork of independent bosses but a unified force with Luciano at the center, pulling the strings. The syndicate would control everything from casinos in Las Vegas to the heroin trade in the streets of New York. It wasn't just about smuggling or rackets anymore, it was about total control of America's underground economy. This national network allowed Luciano to move forward with new criminal ventures, notably gambling operations, which were expanded into new territories. With a national syndicate at his back, he could call on allies in every major city to back his ventures, from running numbers to setting up new illegal casinos, and even creating a web of corrupt labor unions that could help grease the wheels of the criminal machine. As he watched his empire grow, Luciano knew that this was his legacy, a criminal organization that transcended local politics and had the muscle and brains to rival legitimate business. The syndicate, in essence, marked the beginning of organized crime as a sophisticated, nationwide business. It allowed Luciano and his fellow mobsters to exploit new opportunities and secure their control for years to come. What Luciano had done was simple in theory, but monumental in practice. He had turned organized crime from a series of local power struggles into a national corporation. In the world of organized crime, where control and influence often extended beyond the streets, Lucky Luciano knew that power wasn't just about running rackets. It was about shaping events, manipulating outcomes, and making sure that everything worked in his favor. One of the most iconic examples of this was his involvement in fixing the big boxing match between Johnny Dundee and Lou Brouillard in the 1920s, a fight that would further cement Luciano's reputation as someone who could influence even the most public and prestigious of events. Boxing was more than just a sport in the early 20th century, it was a spectacle, a major cultural event that captured the attention of millions. The world of professional boxing was also deeply intertwined with organized crime. Promoters, fighters, and even referees could be bought and sold, manipulated to ensure that the right person won or lost. Luciano, ever the opportunist, saw boxing as a lucrative arena for not only making money but for expanding his influence. He wasn't interested in just betting on the outcome. He wanted to control it. The fight between Johnny Dundee and Lou Brouillard, which took place in 1929, was one that caught Luciano's eye. Dundee was a popular and skilled fighter, but Brouillard, a lesser-known challenger, had the right backing. Luciano, who already had strong ties to the gambling world and was building his influence in boxing circles, saw the potential to fix the match and ensure that Brouillard walked away with the title. It wasn't just about making money on the bets, it was about proving that he could control outcomes in the most public of arenas. Luciano orchestrated the entire thing from behind the scenes. He worked his contacts in the world of boxing, making sure that the right people, managers, trainers, and promoters were all on his side. There were meetings, handshakes, and quiet deals made under the table. The idea was simple. Dundee would take a dive, Brouillard would win, and Luciano would pocket the profits from the fixed betting lines. The fix was in, and it was set to work perfectly. The fight itself was nothing special on the surface. It seemed like a typical bout between two boxers. But behind the scenes, the outcome had already been decided. As expected, Dundee seemed to lose steam, and Brouillard emerged victorious. The crowd roared, but most didn't realize that the real winner wasn't the fighter raising his gloves in victory. It was Luciano, who had manipulated the situation from start to finish, turning a simple boxing match into yet another opportunity to flex his growing influence in the world of organized crime. This event not only showcased Luciano's growing power but also his ability to shape the public's perception of fairness and competition. It was just another reminder that in Luciano's world, nothing was as it seemed, and everything had a price. The fixing of the Dundee-Brouillard fight was a masterstroke of manipulation, one that reinforced Luciano's status as a man who could influence even the most unpredictable and dangerous of worlds. By the early 1930s, Luciano had solidified his dominance in the criminal world. But power came at a price. No one understood this better than him. His rise was built on a mix of strategic alliances and ruthless betrayals. One of the most notable betrayals came from those who were once his closest allies, men he had worked alongside and trusted. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a warning to all who might challenge his authority. It's often said that the price of loyalty in Luciano's world was steep, and for those who tried to cross him, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. The betrayal came in the form of a man who once considered Luciano a friend, Joe the Boss Masseria. Masseria was one of the most powerful figures in the Genovese family, a man whose influence stretched across the city. But Luciano, ever the strategist, knew that Masseria's reign was built on an outdated system of rule. Masseria had never understood the need for unity in the mafia, believing that power came from controlling everything, even if it meant constant warfare with rival families. Luciano saw this as a weakness, and he knew that in order to take full control of New York's criminal empire, Masseria had to be removed. Luciano, who had spent years consolidating his power and making alliances, turned to those closest to Masseria, including his trusted lieutenants, who were growing disillusioned with their boss's leadership. The tipping point came when Luciano orchestrated a meeting with a powerful figure who had once been Masseria's ally, Salvatore "Lucky" Lucania. This was the moment Luciano had been waiting for, the moment he would cement his betrayal of Masseria. The ice pick was a symbol of what Luciano could do when he needed to eliminate a threat. It was swift, brutal, and sent a message. Loyalty to Masseria was no longer enough. The betrayal was executed with chilling precision. Luciano, with the help of his allies, arranged for Masseria to meet with a group of trusted men in a quiet room. What he didn't know was that these men had already pledged their loyalty to Luciano. Masseria was gunned down, but not before he realized that the man he had once mentored had turned on him. The ice pick was a symbol of finality, a reminder that in this world, allegiances were fragile, and betrayal was the ultimate weapon. Luciano's rise was marked by the ability to not just navigate dangerous alliances but to dismantle them when they no longer served his purpose. Masseria's death not only solidified Luciano's control over the mafia but also served as a stark reminder to anyone who might consider challenging him. The world Luciano operated in was unforgiving, and there was no room for those who let loyalty cloud their judgment. For Luciano, the betrayal of Masseria was a moment of triumph, a calculated move that proved he was willing to do whatever it took to secure his place at the top. His ability to navigate the dangerous web of alliances and betrayals made him not just a powerful mobster, but a master of the game. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had transformed organized crime from a chaotic, fragmented system into a streamlined, professional operation. Gone were the days of street brawls and turf wars between petty criminals. Luciano understood that in order to maintain power and control, he needed to modernize the mafia's approach. He wasn't just running rackets, he was building an empire. And to do so, he would have to make it efficient, profitable, and, most importantly, uncontested. The key to his success was his vision of organized crime as a business. Luciano saw that the old ways of the mafia were inefficient. Bosses like Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano ruled with a heavy hand, demanding loyalty but failing to see the potential of a more organized structure. Luciano, however, had a keen eye for opportunity. He recognized that in order to expand and sustain the mafia's operations, there needed to be clear lines of communication, strategic partnerships, and a division of labor that resembled a corporate model. At the heart of Luciano's innovation was the creation of the Commission, a governing body that included the heads of the 5 major New York mafia families. This was a radical departure from the traditional structure, where each family operated independently and often in competition with one another. By bringing the leaders together, Luciano created a sense of unity and cooperation, a model where families could work together, share profits, and reduce unnecessary bloodshed. The commission was designed not just to mediate disputes, but to make sure that everyone was benefiting from the growing criminal enterprise. Luciano was also a shrewd businessman who understood the importance of diversification. His empire didn't just rely on traditional rackets like extortion and gambling. He expanded into industries that were both highly profitable and difficult to track. The bootlegging trade, which had been booming during Prohibition, was a key source of income, but Luciano was quick to realize that the end of Prohibition was not the end of business. Instead of pulling out, he simply shifted focus, turning his attention to new revenue streams like narcotics, unions, and the labor rackets that had long been a part of the mafia's operations. What set Luciano apart was his ability to make crime not just profitable, but predictable. He established long-term relationships with corrupt politicians, law enforcement, and business leaders, ensuring that his operations were protected at every level. In the same way that a CEO might control a company's board members, Luciano managed his family members and allies with precision, making sure everyone knew their role and was compensated fairly. There was no room for ego. Everything had to serve the bottom line. In doing so, Luciano turned the mafia into a well-oiled machine, where everyone had a stake in the game, and profit was the ultimate goal. His influence stretched far beyond the streets of New York. He had created a crime syndicate that operated like a multinational corporation, one that had fingers in every conceivable industry, both legal and illegal. Luciano's approach was revolutionary. He didn't just rule with fear, he ruled with structure, and that was what made him truly untouchable. Lucky Luciano was a man who understood the price of power. For him, violence was not just a tool, it was a currency, essential for both maintaining control and solidifying his empire. Beneath the sleek business structure he built, where crime was organized like a corporate machine, there was always an undercurrent of brutality. Luciano knew that, in the world he inhabited, trust was fragile, and loyalty was often tested by blood. Luciano's approach to violence was calculated. He didn't revel in the chaos or cruelty like some of his contemporaries, but he was never afraid to use it when necessary. In fact, he saw violence as a necessary evil, a means to an end. His ability to dish out punishment with precision, without hesitation, became one of the cornerstones of his rule. It wasn't about mindless bloodshed, it was about sending a message, ensuring that the mafia's power was undisputed. One of the most defining moments in Luciano's relationship with violence came during the power struggles within the mafia, particularly in the battle for control of New York. The elimination of his rivals, including Masseria and Maranzano, was not done out of whim but out of necessity. For Luciano, these were not mere personal rivalries. They were obstacles to his larger vision of a unified, powerful crime syndicate. He understood that in a world dominated by fear and respect, removing those who stood in his way was the only way to ensure his ascent to the top. What set Luciano apart from many of his contemporaries was his ability to wield violence strategically, with an almost surgical precision. He didn't need to be the most violent man in the room. He just needed to be the one willing to take the hardest steps when the situation demanded it. He created a system where violence was not random but purposeful, calculated to serve his interests. His decision to turn to the commission, to create a structure where the various families could cooperate, was made with the understanding that in order to preserve peace, there had to be a threat of force. The violence wasn't always visible. It often operated in the shadows, in whispers and rumors, but it was ever present, and those who understood the code of the mafia knew that any betrayal would be met with swift, brutal retribution. As Luciano's power grew, so did the necessity for more control. The deeper he entrenched himself in the criminal world, the more he had to rely on violence to maintain order, even within his own ranks. For Luciano, the balance between doing business and dealing death was a delicate one, but one he knew all too well. His relationship with violence wasn't born out of bloodlust, but rather out of the cold, hard reality that in the underworld, survival was a fight. And in that fight, violence was not optional, it was indispensable. Lucky Luciano wasn't just a mobster, he was a master manipulator, a man who understood the delicate art of control in a world where power meant everything. He knew that the key to maintaining dominance was not simply through brute force, but through a web of influence, subtle enough to escape notice, but strong enough to ensnare anyone who dared to challenge him. From politicians to businessmen, Luciano had a way of bending the most powerful figures in society to his will, ensuring that his empire ran like a finely tuned machine, all while staying out of the public's eye. At the heart of Luciano's method was his understanding of human nature. He knew that power was not just about wealth, it was about perception, relationships, and, most crucially, loyalty. Luciano had a knack for assessing the weaknesses of others, finding their desires, and making sure they owed him something, be it money, protection, or favors. His ability to make people feel both indebted to him and convinced that they had no other choice but to comply was unmatched. He didn't need to threaten or use force for everyone. He knew how to play the game of influence, how to make people feel like they were in control when, in reality, they were following his script. His relationships with politicians were perhaps the most intricate. Luciano understood that true power in New York wasn't just about controlling the streets. It was about controlling City Hall, the courts, and the police force. He didn't need to be a visible force in politics. His touch was far subtler than that. He built alliances with corrupt politicians, using his wealth and influence to ensure that they turned a blind eye to his activities or, better yet, actively protected him. Through these men, he could shape the laws, sway elections, and, when needed, eliminate threats before they had a chance to rise. But it wasn't just about bribery. Luciano was a shrewd strategist who understood that mutual benefit was the key to a successful partnership. He didn't just make enemies disappear. He made sure that his allies saw the potential in maintaining a relationship with him, one that would benefit them in ways that no one else could offer. Businessmen, too, were caught in his web. Luciano knew that power in the world of organized crime wasn't just about controlling illegal operations. It was about controlling the legitimate economy as well. He had a keen eye for investment opportunities, often stepping into industries that seemed far removed from crime, like trucking, construction, and even the entertainment industry. He built relationships with influential businessmen, offering protection in exchange for a cut of their profits or a seat at the table when deals were made. Luciano understood that the line between legal and illegal was often blurred, and he expertly navigated that gray area, manipulating both sides to ensure his dominance. Through these delicate manipulations, Luciano controlled everything from the streets to the boardrooms, from the ballot boxes to the back rooms where deals were struck. His true genius wasn't in the violence he could wield, but in the unseen force he exerted over the people who thought they were in control, making them dance to his tune without ever realizing it. Lucky Luciano's ascent to the top was more than just the rise of a single man. It marked a pivotal shift in the entire structure of organized crime. The Genovese family, once a powerful but fragmented group, would never be the same again. Luciano's vision for the future was radical, revolutionary even, and it went beyond mere domination. He sought to unify and professionalize the criminal underworld, creating a network so efficient, so organized, that it resembled a legitimate business empire rather than a collection of competing gangs. His transformation from a rising star in the mafia to the undisputed leader of the Genovese family signaled the beginning of a new era. In the early years of Luciano's involvement, the mafia was a patchwork of independent families, each with its own agenda and territory. The constant infighting and lack of coordination created vulnerabilities, and Luciano saw this as a weakness. He knew that the only way to truly rule was to consolidate power and create a system that would be more than just the sum of its parts. As he rose through the ranks, he began to implement a vision that would forever alter the power dynamics of organized crime. When he took control of the Genovese family, it wasn't simply about eliminating rivals. It was about instituting a new way of doing things. Luciano realized that the key to lasting power lay not in brute force, but in strategy. He created the Commission, a governing body that brought together the heads of the 5 major mafia families in New York to cooperate and mediate disputes. This was a radical departure from the chaotic, violent turf wars that had defined the previous era of mafia leadership. Luciano's ability to broker peace and keep the various factions under control made him a respected figure, not just within his own family, but throughout the entire mafia. His rise wasn't without challenges, of course. Luciano had to navigate through treacherous waters, dealing with rival factions within his own family and the betrayal of trusted allies. But he was a master of manipulation and knew how to play the long game. He understood that loyalty, once earned, was more powerful than any weapon, and he carefully cultivated relationships that would see him through even the darkest times. By the time he became the undisputed boss of the Genovese family, he had already begun to reshape the landscape of organized crime in ways no one could have predicted. Luciano's leadership represented more than just a personal triumph. It was the dawn of a new era for the mafia, where power was no longer based solely on violence, but on organization, cooperation, and a ruthless pursuit of wealth. The foundations he laid down would sustain his empire for years, and the influence he wielded would be felt long after his reign. His rise to the top wasn't just about seizing control. It was about redefining what it meant to rule in the world of organized crime. Lucky Luciano's ability to deceive was one of his most powerful tools. It wasn't just about running scams or outsmarting his rivals, it was about mastering the art of illusion. Luciano understood that in the world of organized crime, perception often outweighed reality, and if you could manipulate how others saw you, you could control the game. This made him not just a mobster, but a master strategist, able to weave a web of deception that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement and politics. One of the ways Luciano perfected his deception was through the establishment of legitimate businesses. It wasn't enough to just run rackets. Luciano understood that to shield himself from the authorities, he needed to create a facade of legitimacy. He invested heavily in legal enterprises, from restaurants to docks, and used these fronts to launder money, pay off officials, and mask the true scale of his criminal empire. To the outside world, he appeared to be a legitimate businessman, someone with ties to powerful people but no hint of the underground world he truly controlled. Behind the closed doors of his businesses, however, the operations were anything but lawful. But it wasn't just through business ventures that Luciano deceived. His relationships with law enforcement were equally cunning. He understood the value of cooperation and manipulation, and he wasn't above making deals with the very people who were supposed to bring him down. He had a network of corrupt police officers, judges, and politicians on his payroll, all of whom were more than willing to look the other way in exchange for a cut of his profits. Luciano didn't just bribe law enforcement. He built relationships with them, carefully selecting individuals who would protect him when things got rough. He knew when to play the game, and when to use charm, flattery, or threats to ensure his protection. His ability to deceive even extended to his rivals within the mafia. While many of them saw him as a ruthless, calculating figure, Luciano knew how to hide his true intentions. He didn't rely on brute force alone. He understood the importance of subtlety, and knew that sometimes letting others think they had the upper hand was the best way to ensure his ultimate success. He was patient, often playing the long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. This strategy kept him several steps ahead of those who sought to dethrone him, as they underestimated his ability to outwit them. Luciano's mastery of deception wasn't just a reflection of his intelligence, it was a survival mechanism. In a world where betrayal was common and loyalty was often fleeting, he knew that the only way to stay ahead was to remain unpredictable, to keep his enemies and allies alike guessing. Through clever manipulation, he could control the flow of information, blur the lines between what was real and what was illusion, and ultimately, stay in control of his empire. Lucky Luciano was a man who understood the importance of alliances. In the world of organized crime, trust was a rare commodity, but Luciano knew that to survive and thrive, he needed to establish relationships that were built on mutual benefit, not just fear. His ability to negotiate and make deals with other crime families was one of his greatest strengths, and it helped him craft an empire that would dominate the American underworld for decades. One of Luciano's most infamous agreements was the establishment of the so-called gentleman's agreement with the heads of other major crime families. It was a deal that reshaped the entire structure of organized crime in the United States. At the time, the mafia was fragmented, with numerous families operating independently, each vying for control over territories, rackets, and markets. There was constant infighting, bloodshed, and an overwhelming sense of chaos. Luciano, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity to create a more organized and unified structure. He recognized that the families were stronger together than apart, and that a peaceful coexistence with shared profits and an agreed-upon structure, would benefit everyone in the long run. Luciano's brilliance lay in his ability to get the most powerful figures in the mafia to agree to terms that not only elevated him, but also protected their interests. The gentleman's agreement was built on a simple premise. Instead of constant turf wars, the families would share control over different areas, dividing the power among themselves in a way that avoided direct conflict. Luciano was able to broker this peace, ensuring that the families worked together to profit from the same pools of money rather than fighting over them. It was a move that brought a sense of order to a once chaotic underworld. The agreement also established the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the most powerful families. The Commission became the central authority in mafia decision-making, with Luciano playing a pivotal role in its creation. This allowed him to consolidate power and control over the most lucrative rackets, while also ensuring that other families were equally invested in maintaining the peace. Luciano's ability to play the role of mediator, balancing the egos and ambitions of his peers, further cemented his position as the kingpin of organized crime. However, the gentleman's agreement was not without its critics. Some of the more traditionalists in the mafia, who preferred a more aggressive and isolated approach to crime, saw Luciano's approach as weak. They resented the notion of sharing power and profits, preferring the old ways of doing business. But Luciano, ever the visionary, understood that in a world that was changing rapidly, both in terms of law enforcement tactics and the global reach of crime, adaptability was key. The gentleman's agreement was a gamble, but it paid off. It allowed Luciano to extend his influence far beyond New York, creating a network that stretched across the country. It was, without a doubt, one of the most important moves in the history of organized crime. Luciano's influence was not limited to the shadows of New York streets or the back rooms of speakeasies. His reach extended far beyond the world of organized crime, touching areas of American life that most people wouldn't even think to connect with the mafia. One of the most significant and often overlooked areas where Luciano's influence made a mark was Hollywood. While the film industry was still in its infancy during Luciano's rise to power, it was rapidly growing into the entertainment behemoth it would soon become. Luciano, ever the opportunist, recognized the potential to exploit this emerging industry for his benefit. Hollywood, at the time, was a town of stars and glamour, but it was also a town full of money and power. Like any other business, it required financing, connections, and at times muscle to keep things running smoothly. Luciano knew that if he could tap into this world, he could establish a new form of leverage that would benefit his criminal empire. His involvement was not as a flashy player in the public eye, but as a silent partner, an invisible force that made things happen behind the scenes. Luciano's ties to Hollywood were most notably seen through his connections with film, producers, and studio heads. He was known to have worked with some of the biggest names in the industry, using his criminal network to help secure financing for films, protect investments, and, on occasion, settle disputes that would otherwise have been handled quietly with threats. His influence was particularly strong when it came to the unions that controlled labor in the film industry. Through his connections, Luciano was able to manipulate the labor unions, ensuring that the industry remained under his control. This was not an accident, of course. Luciano understood that in a city like Hollywood, where ambition and wealth intertwined, the key to power was controlling access. He would have his people positioned to monitor the most influential studios and directors, ensuring that his criminal interests were protected and advanced. With such deep ties, it wasn't long before Luciano had a hand in shaping the direction of the industry, albeit from behind the curtain. But his influence went beyond mere business deals. Luciano's reputation as a ruthless operator gave him the ability to broker peace between feuding figures in Hollywood, much like he did within the mafia. His role as a mediator made him an invaluable ally, even to the stars, actors, directors, and producers who found themselves in trouble often turned to Luciano's connections, knowing that he could make problems disappear or at least offer them a solution that kept their careers intact. In some cases, it's said that Luciano even helped resolve personal conflicts between Hollywood's elite, further cementing his role as an unspoken kingmaker in the industry. Though Luciano never sought the spotlight, his involvement in Hollywood proved to be yet another way he extended his empire. The films and stars of the time were nothing more than another stage for Luciano's performance, one where he wasn't just a mob boss, but a shadow that loomed over one of America's most influential industries. Through his control of both the criminal world and Hollywood, Luciano had not only redefined the mafia's role in American society, but had also helped shape the future of the entertainment industry. As Luciano's power grew, so did the resistance against him. The streets of New York, once ruled by various small-time crooks and local gangs, were now under the watchful eyes of Luciano's syndicate, a group that would eventually dominate the criminal landscape in ways that had never been seen before. But with power came opposition, and the turf wars that erupted between Luciano's operation and rival gangs were as violent as they were inevitable. Luciano had done what many before him had failed to accomplish. He united the fractured crime families into a cohesive force. But in doing so, he made enemies of those who had once been his allies or had simply resisted the new order. Old-school gangsters, who had grown comfortable with their independent rackets, were now faced with a growing syndicate that controlled everything from bootlegging to narcotics, gambling to unions. Those who opposed Luciano were forced to defend their shrinking territories, and in some cases, they fought with everything they had, leading to bloody confrontations that painted the streets red. One of the most notorious and bloody of these turf wars was the battle between Luciano's syndicate and the rival Castellamarese clan, led by the ambitious Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano, an old-world boss with traditional values, saw Luciano's rise as a threat to the established power structure. He didn't understand the business model. Luciano was constructing a model built on cooperation rather than the chaotic violence that had previously defined the mafia. Luciano, with his cool head and forward-thinking vision, knew that to establish lasting control, he would have to eliminate any challenge to his power. The war was inevitable. The clashes between Luciano's forces and Maranzano's loyalists were bloody. Rivals were gunned down in broad daylight, homes were raided, and bodies turned up in alleys. The violence was swift, brutal, and efficient. The streets became battlefields, with rival gangsters vying for control of neighborhoods, turf, and the lucrative illicit businesses that came with them. In these dark, violent moments, Luciano's ability to plan and control became evident. His forces were not just ruthless, they were precise. He didn't rely solely on violence. He understood the value of strategy, manipulation, and, at times, the quiet intimidation of his enemies. But Luciano's strength wasn't only in his ability to wage war, it was in his ability to anticipate. His syndicate, backed by the muscle of soldiers like Vito Genovese and the strategic minds of men like Frank Costello, proved to be more organized than their rivals. Luciano played the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, making calculated moves while others reacted impulsively. This mastery of tactics, both on the streets and within the boardrooms of his crime empire, gave him the upper hand. Ultimately, the bloody war culminated in the fall of Maranzano, who was assassinated in 1931. His death marked the end of the old guard, and with it, Luciano's ascendancy to the undisputed king of New York's underworld. The streets that had been soaked with blood now belonged to Luciano and his carefully crafted syndicate. The turf wars, though costly, had been won. Luciano's rise to power had been marked by a careful balance of ruthless strategy, calculated alliances, and the ability to control his enemies before they even knew they were being played. But in the early 1930s, the unthinkable happened. A betrayal, as sharp and sudden as a knife to the back, threatened to unravel everything he had spent years building. On February 2, 1936, in a move that stunned even those closest to him, the law finally caught up with Luciano in the form of a carefully orchestrated arrest. The arrest wasn't a random act of law enforcement. This was the culmination of years of political maneuvering. It was a setup, an inside job designed to bring down not just Luciano, but the entire network he had so masterfully woven together. The police had been trying to get Luciano for years, but each time they were thwarted, whether by bribery, threats, or sheer intimidation. Yet, despite all his power, it was a simple thing that tripped him up: his involvement in the illegal vice rackets, particularly prostitution. It was something Luciano had downplayed, knowing that as long as he kept a low profile and didn't push too hard, his empire could keep growing unchecked. But that wasn't the case anymore. What made the betrayal even more bitter was that it came not from the enemies he had fought on the streets, but from within. The politicians and police officers Luciano had once paid to look the other way now turned on him. Those who had benefited from his wealth and influence saw the tide shifting and decided to pull the rug out from under him. A massive sting operation, hidden behind a web of bribery and deceit, finally led to his capture. But the betrayal didn't just come from the officers who arrested him. It came from those close to him who had sold him out in exchange for favors, promises, and their own protection. As he sat behind bars, Luciano realized the true cost of his empire. Power, it seemed, could never be fully trusted, even when it was within arm's reach. His allies had abandoned him when it mattered most. His empire, once a formidable force, was suddenly vulnerable, with everyone from his own men to the political figures he'd once controlled turning their backs on him. But even in the face of betrayal, Luciano remained calculating. The arrest was a significant blow, but it wasn't the end. Despite his downfall, Luciano's mind never stopped working, always thinking ahead, plotting his comeback. The betrayal had shaken his empire, yes, but it had also given him the clarity he needed to rebuild. Behind bars, Luciano continued to manipulate, ensuring that his syndicate would survive even if he didn't. His arrest didn't mark the end of his reign. It was merely a shift in his strategy, the beginning of a new chapter in his criminal empire. It was a reminder that in the world he had built, no one, not even the king himself, was immune from betrayal. The arrest of Lucky Luciano was just the beginning of the storm that would shake his criminal empire to its core. In the months that followed, the world watched with bated breath as Luciano was thrust into the spotlight. The trial, which would go down in history as one of the most sensational of the century, wasn't just about a gangster on trial. It was a spectacle. The courtroom became a battleground, not just for justice, but for control over the very heart of organized crime in America. Luciano faced multiple charges, but the most damning were those related to his involvement in running a vast prostitution ring that spanned the city. It was a crime that hit at the very core of society's moral compass, the type of criminal activity that grabbed headlines and shocked the public. The prosecution had a strong case, with numerous witnesses lined up to testify against him, but Luciano's defense was just as formidable. He was no stranger to playing the game, and this time, he wasn't alone. His legal team worked tirelessly to discredit the testimonies and paint him as a victim of political manipulation and law enforcement corruption. The trial itself became a media frenzy, attracting crowds and journalists from all over. People were eager to witness the downfall of the man who had ruled New York's underworld with an iron fist. The courtroom was filled with whispers, tension thick in the air, as each piece of evidence was presented. But Luciano was no ordinary defendant. His charm, his sharp mind, and his unflinching demeanor allowed him to manipulate the proceedings. As each witness took the stand, Luciano would sit back, observing with cold precision. His sharp eyes never missed a detail, and he understood the weight of every word spoken. But despite his best efforts, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The government had a case that was hard to refute. Prosecutors linked him directly to organized crime, using a network of informants and wiretaps to gather damning evidence. Luciano's involvement in the vast web of illicit activities was laid bare for the public to see. The jury, swayed by the mountain of evidence, found him guilty on multiple counts. The conviction was a turning point. It marked the end of Luciano's reign as an untouchable kingpin and the beginning of his time behind bars. But even in defeat, Luciano never lost his composure. He had spent years learning the art of manipulation, and now he would use every trick in the book to ensure his empire's survival. His sentence was a lengthy one. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, but he still held a grip on the criminal world, even from within the confines of a cell. The trial, while it stripped him of his freedom, cemented his legacy. Luciano's conviction was a moment of reckoning for the world of organized crime, but it also proved something deeper, that even in the face of a courtroom's harsh glare, Luciano remained a master of his own fate, navigating the treacherous waters of law and order with the same calculated precision he had used to build his empire. After his conviction, lucky Luciano found himself in a place he had never anticipated, exiled from the country he had ruled with an iron grip for years. The authorities, eager to rid themselves of the notorious gangster, deported him to Italy in 1946, stripping him of his American citizenship. It seemed like the final chapter in the life of the man who had changed the landscape of organized crime forever. Yet, Luciano was not a man defined by borders or geography. Even from across the ocean, he maintained an extraordinary hold on his empire, a testament to his enduring power and reach. Luciano's new life in Italy was far removed from the luxurious comforts he had once enjoyed in New York. But it didn't take long for him to reassert himself in the world of crime. From the moment he set foot on Italian soil, he began working his influence, reaching out to his contacts in America. His ability to keep in touch with his underlings back in the States through carefully orchestrated messages, intermediaries, and the occasional phone call was unmatched. Despite being thousands of miles away, Luciano continued to call the shots. He kept tabs on his old associates, guiding them through the shifting dynamics of the mafia world, offering advice and making decisions that carried weight from afar. In Italy, Luciano's presence was marked by a certain quiet defiance. While other exiled gangsters might have faded into the shadows, Luciano maintained his sense of purpose, using his time to forge new relationships and gain control over the thriving criminal enterprises operating across Europe. He was no longer in charge of the day-to-day operations of the American syndicate, but his voice still carried weight in the underground world. His influence stretched far beyond the shores of Italy, as he continued to direct activities from his Italian home, using his reputation to sway decisions in the U.S. and Europe alike. Even in exile, Luciano's genius for business remained. He recognized the changing times and the opportunities they presented. His insight into the international nature of the criminal enterprise led him to invest in illicit activities that would span continents. By the time he passed away, Luciano had transformed himself into a figure who was more than just a kingpin. He was a symbol of the interconnectedness of organized crime, with his network stretching from Sicily to the streets of New York. And while his body was far from the streets he once ruled, Luciano's mind never stopped working. He had built an empire that no exile, no matter how distant, could ever truly sever. Luciano's exile in Italy proved that even in the face of defeat, even when removed from the game, his influence would continue to echo. It wasn't the end of his power, it was merely a shift. A man who had once controlled the largest and most powerful criminal syndicate in the world wasn't going to fade away quietly. Instead, Luciano remained a puppet master from afar, pulling the strings of a world that would never be the same without him. In the years following his deportation, lucky Luciano found himself in a land that was both familiar and foreign. The streets of Italy, though a far cry from the bustling avenues of New York, held their own kind of power. Here, in the heart of Sicily, Luciano continued to pull the strings of a vast empire from the shadows. Stripped of his American citizenship and bound by the constraints of his exile, he was a king without a crown. But that did not mean he was powerless. His mind, sharp as ever, never ceased to work. In the quiet isolation of his Italian residence, Luciano would spend hours plotting, writing letters, and making calls through trusted intermediaries. He would often meet with members of the Sicilian mafia, forging alliances that spanned the Mediterranean. Luciano had always known the value of loyalty, and even in exile, he had no intention of allowing his legacy to fade into the background. He knew that his influence, while weakened, still held significant weight among those who owed their rise to the very syndicate he had crafted. Despite his distance from America, Luciano was still considered a mastermind of the mafia's operations across the globe. From Italy, he maintained connections with the Sicilian families, advising them on strategy, trade, and loyalty. He would often reminisce about his days as a leader, but never with regret. Instead, he saw his exile as an opportunity to strengthen his position. From Sicily, Luciano continued to influence the direction of American organized crime, passing information and offering advice through trusted associates. His reputation, after all, was not one easily diminished. While the power he once held in New York had been eroded by time, the networks he had created were deeply entrenched, and they still listened. Luciano's relationship with the Sicilian mafia, in particular, grew stronger over the years. The families in Sicily, once skeptical of his methods, came to respect his leadership. Luciano, with his strategic mind and understanding of the international underworld, provided them with the guidance they needed to expand their reach. Though he was no longer in the thick of the day-to-day business, Luciano had found a new place for himself, one where he could work in the shadows, his influence seeping into the operations of the mafia. For Luciano, life in exile was not one of quiet retirement. He had been a king of the streets, and even without a crown, he knew how to rule. His exile might have taken him away from the limelight, but it did not diminish his status or his ability to sway the decisions of the men who now ran the businesses he had once owned. Luciano may have been physically removed from the empire he created, but his presence lingered both in Sicily and in the criminal world that stretched across oceans, still bound by the threads he had woven. In the early 1940s, as the world stood on the precipice of a new era, Lucky Luciano's name was still synonymous with power. Though in exile, his influence reached far beyond the Mediterranean shores of Sicily. His reputation as a master strategist and kingpin of the American mafia continued to resonate through the corridors of crime. It was at this time that one of the most significant, and perhaps most infamous, meetings of Luciano's career took place. A meeting that would solidify his ties to the world's most powerful crime syndicates, bringing together men from across the globe, some in search of profit, others, like Luciano, in search of control. The year was 1946, and the location was Casablanca, Morocco. The underworld, too, was shifting, with new opportunities emerging amidst the ashes of conflict. Luciano, who had long been in exile, was invited to this clandestine gathering by his associates in the international crime scene. His role was crucial. He was not just a boss of the American mafia. He had become a bridge between the old-world criminal enterprises of Europe and the burgeoning power of the United States. The meeting was one of necessity and opportunity. The men who gathered in the dimly lit rooms of Casablanca were powerful and influential, each representing different factions of the criminal world, from the Sicilian mafia to the French Corsicans, the American syndicates, and even the Eastern European cartels. What united them was their desire for peace in the criminal underworld, an understanding that the old ways of chaos and competition could no longer yield the best results. Luciano, ever the visionary, knew that the time had come for a new system, one built on collaboration rather than conflict. In those heated hours, discussions of territory, partnerships, and profits filled the room. Luciano's voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the tension. His charisma, his ability to read men and situations, allowed him to guide the negotiations with a steady hand. By the time the meeting ended, Luciano had not only reinforced his position as the top authority in the American mafia, but had also forged lasting alliances with the most influential figures in global organized crime. The foundations for what would become the National Crime Syndicate were laid in those smoky rooms, a unified front of power that stretched across borders and oceans. As the men left Casablanca, the meeting remained shrouded in secrecy, its significance only fully understood in retrospect. For Luciano, it was a moment of consolidation, a rare opportunity to shape the future of the underworld from the shadows of exile. The Casablanca meeting marked the height of his influence, a point at which his connections to the biggest crime syndicates in the world were solidified, ensuring that even in exile, Luciano would remain a key figure in the global criminal landscape for years to come. Lucky Luciano's influence extended far beyond the dark alleys and smoky back rooms of New York. It reached into the glitzy, sun-soaked streets of Hollywood. In the post-war years, the film industry was growing into a global powerhouse, and Luciano, ever the visionary, recognized early on the potential for organized crime to infiltrate this burgeoning empire. Though he had been deported to Italy, his connections and power stretched across continents, and his ties to Hollywood were forged through his men, who still operated with ruthless efficiency in the United States. In the 1940s and 1950s, the mafia's grip on the West Coast was tightening. The mob saw Hollywood as more than just a place for the production of films. It was an opportunity to influence the industry, control the flow of money, and, most importantly, establish a foothold in one of the most lucrative industries in the world. Luciano had long understood the value of partnerships, and he was determined to secure one with Hollywood's most influential figures. Through various intermediaries, Luciano facilitated deals that involved mob-run gambling operations, using the film industry as a front to launder money and solidify his empire. His connections ran deep, and Hollywood quickly became another extension of his criminal syndicate. The first step in Luciano's Hollywood venture was gambling. Los Angeles, with its glitz and glamour, provided the perfect backdrop for mob operations. The mafia began to control not only the casinos in Nevada, but also established an illicit presence in the underground gambling scene on the West Coast. Luciano's men ran numbers, rackets, poker games, and even fixed horse races, all of which brought in massive sums of cash. The money was funneled into legitimate businesses, including a growing network of film studios and theaters. Hollywood, in turn, became a source of both wealth and influence for Luciano, providing him with a profitable avenue to expand his reach even further. But Luciano's impact on Hollywood was not limited to the world of gambling. The mafia's presence in the film industry grew as mobsters began to make deals with film producers, actors, and directors, ensuring that the mob had a say in the kinds of films being made and how they were distributed. Luciano's men were involved in the financing of movies, making sure that the proper kickbacks flowed through the right channels. Hollywood studios, eager for capital, often found themselves bending to the will of these powerful underworld figures. The result was a relationship based on mutual benefit, one that allowed the mob to not only launder money, but also to secure a grip on an industry that was both profitable and influential. Luciano's legacy in Hollywood, though often obscured by the glamour of the silver screen, was undeniable. His connections to the film industry helped shape the mafia's reach in America, and his influence remained a shadow over Hollywood for years to come. Even in exile, Luciano's name was whispered in the corridors of the studios, a reminder that the real power in the industry wasn't always on the screen, but behind the scenes, where the mob's hand was often at work. Luciano's exile in Italy never fully severed his connection to the U.S. mafia. Even from afar, his influence remained potent, a ghost haunting the dark halls of American crime. But in the late 1940s, after years of maneuvering, a deal was struck, one that would allow Luciano to return to the United States. It was a moment that signaled more than just his personal redemption. It was a testament to the power he still wielded, even from a distant shore. The deal, brokered by his allies and with the tacit approval of government officials, was a strategic move. Luciano's return wasn't just a win for him. It was a clear signal to both his enemies and his allies that he had never truly been out of the game. His brief return to the United States was more than symbolic. It represented the unshakable reach of his criminal empire. The deal allowed Luciano to return for a brief period, but it came with conditions. He was to remain largely out of the public eye, a figurehead rather than an active participant in the syndicate's daily operations. However, the power dynamics of organized crime were never quite so simple. Though he was not to be involved in the day-to-day operations, Luciano's presence had an almost magnetic pull on the mafia families. His return revitalized old alliances and helped cement the power of the Genovese family, his old stomping grounds. Even in exile, his voice carried weight. He was the architect of the mafia's expansion and remained a revered, feared figure. During his short-lived return, Luciano was often seen only by those who needed to consult him on matters of crucial importance. His advice was invaluable. His understanding of the underworld, its players, its nuances, and its dangers was unmatched. In the world of organized crime, where shifting allegiances and constant power struggles made things volatile, Luciano's experience and intellect made him an indispensable asset. Though he was no longer in control of his vast network, his mere presence served as a reminder of the authority he had once commanded. Yet, Luciano's return to the U.S. wasn't without its challenges. As time passed, the criminal landscape had shifted. New players had emerged, some of them with ambitions that rivaled Luciano's own. But even as others attempted to assert their dominance, the legacy of Luciano continued to loom large. He was no longer the feared kingpin he had once been, but his influence was undeniable. His ability to navigate the complex underworld, even from afar, continued to shape the dynamics of the U.S. mafia. Luciano's return, though brief, solidified his status as a key figure in the evolution of organized crime. He might have been exiled from the U.S., but his grip on the mafia's soul was as strong as ever. Even in his later years, as he retreated further from the criminal world, his legend remained unbroken. The return of the king wasn't just a return of a man, it was the return of an era. Luciano's brilliance lay not just in his ruthless drive, but in his remarkable understanding of business. His vision was always far beyond the street-level violence and extortion that most mobsters focused on. To Luciano, organized crime was an enterprise, a complex web of legal and illegal ventures that could be managed, expanded, and monetized, just like any corporation. He realized early on that the key to power wasn't only in muscle or intimidation, it was in control, efficiency, and most importantly, structure. He took a business-like approach to the mafia, treating it as a highly organized, multi-layered entity. Luciano's mastery of logistics made him a force to be reckoned with. He understood the need to diversify and create operations that could feed into one another, creating a seamless network of criminal enterprises. Gambling, bootlegging, labor unions, narcotics, all these were not separate entities, but interconnected pieces of a larger puzzle. He didn't just control one piece of the city's underworld. He owned entire sections of it. Where most of his peers were content to fight for turf, Luciano focused on forging alliances and creating a system that allowed for the smooth exchange of information and resources. He wasn't looking to conquer. He was looking to unify. His creation of the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the 5 major families, was a game-changing move. It wasn't just about power, it was about order. With the Commission in place, Luciano ensured that conflicts were minimized, resources were distributed efficiently, and the mafia could function like a well-oiled machine. His approach was smart, calculated, and, most importantly, forward-thinking. Luciano's strategic vision was also evident in his ability to build and maintain relationships with key figures in legitimate businesses and politics. While many of his contemporaries remained mired in petty turf wars, Luciano took a broader view. He knew that to truly thrive, he needed connections outside the criminal world. His ties with politicians, union leaders, and even law enforcement officials gave him access to resources that others could only dream of. Luciano understood the importance of legal cover for illegal operations. He cultivated a network of contacts that ensured his criminal activities could continue with minimal interference from the authorities. But it wasn't just about the numbers for Luciano, it was about creating a legacy. His vision extended beyond his own lifetime. He wanted to build a criminal empire that would stand the test of time. While others were focused on short-term gains, Luciano focused on sustainability. His ability to think long-term allowed him to navigate the volatile world of organized crime with a stability that few could replicate. Luciano's understanding of business was the cornerstone of his success. His strategic vision redefined what it meant to be a mob boss, making him not just a criminal mastermind but a revolutionary figure in the world of organized crime. Luciano had an uncanny ability to make deals, a skill that went beyond mere negotiation. For him, it wasn't just about striking agreements. It was about creating systems where loyalty, power, and respect flowed seamlessly. He understood that in the world he operated in, power wasn't just about controlling territory, it was about maintaining relationships, fostering trust, and knowing when to give as much as when to take. This understanding of the art of the deal made him a dominant force in the criminal world. Luciano's approach to deals was calculated. He never approached a negotiation with the expectation that everything would go his way, but rather, he knew how to position himself as indispensable. He'd give a little to get a lot, and every deal he made had a long-term strategy behind it. He knew that deals made in a moment of weakness or desperation were rarely beneficial, so he always waited for the right time to strike. Timing, for him, was everything. He could wait patiently, bide his time, and when the opportunity arose, he pounced with precision. His ability to read people and understand their motives gave him a significant advantage in negotiations. Loyalty was the foundation of Luciano's empire, and he knew how to nurture it. His deals were often built on a handshake, and his word was his bond. But Luciano also understood that loyalty had to be earned, and that was where his brilliance shone. He knew when to reward loyalty and when to punish betrayal. His loyalty was never blind. He kept his allies close, but also kept an eye on them, ensuring they were as invested in their shared success as he was. This allowed him to build a network of powerful figures who would not only respect him, but also fear crossing him. But loyalty wasn't a one-way street. Luciano made sure that his men felt valued, never leaving them to fend for themselves in a world that could quickly turn hostile. He knew that loyalty could be easily swayed if not nurtured, so he cultivated relationships based on mutual benefit. He often made deals with those in need, extending a helping hand when it was least expected, only to call in favors when the time was right. These small but strategic moves paid off in loyalty that was unwavering, even when the odds were stacked against him. Luciano's dealings weren't just confined to the underworld. His capacity to navigate between both legitimate and criminal circles made him indispensable. He built partnerships that allowed his syndicate to operate with relative impunity, securing protection, business ventures, and even political support. The deals he made weren't just about money, they were about securing power, stability, and a legacy. In the end, Luciano's ability to make deals was a testament to his intelligence, his understanding of human nature, and his uncanny skill in weaving a network of power and loyalty. Each deal, whether big or small, was part of a larger plan that cemented his place as one of the most influential figures in organized crime. His empire wasn't just built on violence, it was built on the strategic, thoughtful art of the deal. Luciano knew that power wasn't just about strength in numbers or the control of territory. To truly dominate, you needed to build alliances, dangerous ones. These connections weren't just forged with fellow criminals, but with individuals who held influence in areas where Luciano couldn't directly reach. His understanding of the world was sophisticated, and he knew the value of aligning himself with those who could protect or enable his empire. Even when that meant stepping into murky waters, his ties to politicians were essential. These were the individuals who could make or break the legal landscape in which Luciano operated. They could make laws bend to his will or ensure that the authorities turned a blind eye to his activities. Luciano wasn't naive enough to think that all politicians could be trusted unconditionally, but he was brilliant in recognizing those whose ambitions, weaknesses, or financial needs could be leveraged, whether it was city officials, judges, or high-ranking government figures. Luciano had a way of keeping them on his side. In exchange for campaign donations, jobs for family members, or political favors, he ensured they looked the other way when his dealings went beyond the boundaries of the law. But it wasn't just politicians who were in Luciano's orbit. His dealings with law enforcement were just as crucial. He understood that in a world where the criminal and legal systems collided, the key to survival was having the right people inside. Luciano knew that the law was a tool, one that could either be an obstacle or an ally. His ties to corrupt officers, whether they were patrolmen or higher-ranking detectives, provided him with a steady flow of information. These alliances allowed him to operate with impunity, often getting word of raids before they happened or having cases dropped entirely. He even had connections within the courts, ensuring that charges were reduced or dropped entirely through quiet persuasion, the right bribe, or sometimes a well-timed political push. But Luciano didn't simply rely on corruption within the system. He understood the psychology of those in power, how ambition, greed, and self-preservation could be manipulated. Whether it was offering something as small as a lucrative business deal or as significant as ensuring a political career's success, Luciano could exploit any vulnerability. He knew that the system, both criminal and legal, was a web of favors, debts, and allegiances, and he excelled at weaving himself into the center of it. By the time Luciano reached the peak of his power, he wasn't just a figurehead of organized crime. He was the nexus between criminal networks, politicians, law enforcement, and businessmen. His alliances, though dangerous, were calculated. Every handshake, every favor, every connection served a greater purpose. They were all pieces on a chessboard, and Luciano played the game with cold precision. His ability to manipulate these dangerous alliances was one of the reasons his empire grew so formidable. He didn't just control people, he controlled the system itself. Luciano's empire wasn't just built on violence or power, it was built on money. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that wealth was the foundation upon which his criminal empire would stand. But Luciano wasn't interested in the quick, short-term gains that many criminals chase. He had a vision that stretched far beyond the streets of New York. understanding that true power came from creating a financial empire that could weather any storm, whether it came from law enforcement, rival gangs, or shifting public opinion. At the heart of Luciano's financial dealings was his ability to operate beyond the criminal world. He wasn't just running illegal rackets, he was building businesses, real businesses, with legitimate fronts that generated massive amounts of money. From trucking companies to alcohol distribution, from gambling operations to unions, Luciano made sure his operations were woven into the fabric of society. He didn't just want to control the underground economy, he wanted a stake in the legitimate one. By using his influence and connections, he could funnel money into legitimate businesses, giving him the appearance of an upstanding businessman, while simultaneously ensuring that the profits from his criminal enterprises flowed through these ventures, washing the dirty money clean. His operations were global in scope. The docks of New York were his playground, but his reach extended far beyond. He had ties to the shipping industry, the construction sector, and even international trade. By using these legitimate businesses as vehicles, Luciano could move vast amounts of money without drawing attention to his criminal activities. He had eyes and ears in every corner of the financial world, from bank accounts in Switzerland to businessmen in Chicago. His ability to keep his dealings covert, to launder money through legitimate channels, made him nearly untouchable. Luciano's financial empire wasn't just about power or control, it was about creating a legacy. He understood that wealth was the key to longevity. The more money he amassed, the harder it became for anyone to take him down. Money could buy silence, buy loyalty, and, most importantly, buy time. When law enforcement came knocking, Luciano didn't have to worry. He could use his wealth to delay investigations, bribe key figures, or simply outlast any attempt to dismantle his empire. It gave him the power to choose his battles, ensuring that his enemies were the ones who had to live in fear of running out of time. But Luciano's wealth didn't just serve him. It served his family, his associates, and his network of loyal men. He made sure that they were financially secure, that they had everything they needed to build their own legacies. Through strategic investments, lucrative deals, and a well-established network of allies in the legitimate business world, Luciano secured his place not just in the annals of criminal history, but in the corridors of power, where money and influence shaped the fate of entire industries. In the end, Luciano's financial empire became the backbone of his legacy, a legacy of wealth, power, and control that extended far beyond the world of crime and into the heart of the American business world. Luciano's influence wasn't confined to the dark corners of crime. It reached deep into the boardrooms, stock markets, and offices of powerful businessmen. He had long since realized that in order to secure his place at the top, he needed more than just muscle. He needed the power of the financial world, the subtle, unseen hand that could shape the outcome of political deals, protect his empire from legal challenges, and maintain his hold on wealth without ever raising suspicion. He operated like a shadow in the background, his influence palpable but often undetectable. Behind the legitimate businesses that he controlled, there was always a hidden layer of manipulation, a subtle dance that ensured that everything, from the banks to the unions, from construction companies to entertainment empires, worked in Luciano's favor. His reach extended into the highest echelons of New York's business world, and he knew how to use that power to manipulate the stock market, sway financial decisions, and direct resources toward his interests. What most people didn't see was how many of these companies were quietly operating under his control, through proxies, shell companies, or indirect investments. Luciano's ability to hide his hand was unparalleled. He never had to sit at the head of the table. He knew that the real power was in making decisions from the shadows. The men who were publicly in charge of his businesses, lawyers, businessmen, even politicians, were just actors in a play he had written. They would make the speeches, attend the meetings, and sign the documents, but it was Luciano's orders they followed. He controlled the financial world with a precision that left no trace of his involvement, and it allowed him to expand his criminal empire while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. One of his most brilliant strategies was the use of legal businesses to launder money and protect his wealth. While the world was watching his illicit activities, Luciano ensured that his assets were safely hidden in plain sight, generating profits through perfectly legitimate enterprises. Real estate, shipping, and even hotels were avenues through which he could funnel vast sums of money without arousing suspicion. By owning legitimate companies, Luciano ensured that he could move freely in the social circles of the wealthy and powerful, blending in while subtly influencing decisions from behind the scenes. The hidden hand was not just about money, it was about power. Luciano knew that the real influence came not from being the loudest in the room, but from being the one who silently pulled the strings. His relationships with bankers, lawyers, and businessmen were all part of a delicate web he had woven over the years, ensuring that his empire was protected no matter how hard law enforcement or his enemies tried to tear it down. As long as the hidden hand moved in silence, Luciano's reach would continue to extend, unchecked and unstoppable. Even in the world of high finance, where nothing was ever truly as it seemed, Luciano was always in control. Luciano's approach to leadership was built on a foundation of principles that kept his empire intact and his men loyal. It wasn't just about muscle or money, it was about respect, trust, and the understanding that power had to be handled with care. His code wasn't written down in books or handed down through speeches. It was something that lived in the way he interacted with his subordinates and rivals alike, something unspoken but always felt in the room. One of the core tenets of Luciano's philosophy was loyalty. It wasn't just a matter of obeying orders, it was about unwavering commitment to the family. Betrayal was the highest sin in his world, and the consequences were swift and brutal. But loyalty didn't mean blind obedience. Luciano respected those who could think for themselves, those who were willing to make tough decisions and put the family's interests above all else. It was a balance between submission and respect, a dance of power where the leader was always one step ahead, but the followers were never completely powerless. This sense of loyalty created an unbreakable bond between Luciano and his men, a bond that would last through the many wars and betrayals that marked his rise to the top. Alongside loyalty came the principle of discretion. Luciano was a master of secrecy, not just in his criminal dealings, but in every facet of his life. He understood the importance of keeping things quiet. Only the right people were allowed to know the full extent of his operations. His men operated under a simple rule: say nothing, know only what you need to know, and keep your mouth shut. Luciano was a master of controlling information, and it was this ability to keep his business dealings out of the public eye that allowed his empire to thrive despite constant scrutiny from law enforcement. Another key element of his code was fairness. Luciano, despite his violent ways, was known for being a just leader within his organization. He didn't tolerate arbitrary violence or senseless cruelty. Every decision, every punishment, was measured and calculated to ensure that order and respect were maintained within the family. He wasn't a man who sought out trouble for the sake of it, but if a man crossed him or threatened the family, Luciano would strike swiftly, leaving no room for doubt about who was in charge. But even then, his actions were guided by a sense of balance. He didn't kill out of rage or emotion, but out of necessity. Luciano's code also included a deep understanding of the business side of things. Power was not just about intimidation. It was about influence, about making deals and forging partnerships that would benefit him and the family. He understood that in the world of organized crime, money spoke louder than guns, and that true power lay in the ability to control both. His strategic mind allowed him to navigate the shifting alliances and rivalries of the criminal underworld, always knowing when to strike and when to retreat. In the end, Luciano's code was simple but effective. It wasn't about being the loudest or the most ruthless. It was about being the smartest, the most controlled, and the most loyal. It was a code that allowed him to rule the mafia with a steady hand, and it was this code that cemented his place as one of the most influential and feared figures in the criminal world. The fall of Luciano was as inevitable as his rise. In a world defined by betrayal, shifting alliances, and the unrelenting pursuit of power, no one could remain at the top forever. By the early 1940s, Luciano's empire, once thriving and unchallenged, began to show signs of strain. It was not the violence or the enemies on the streets that signaled his decline, but the subtle erosion of his control from within, a creeping realization that the very system he built was beginning to outgrow him. Luciano had always been a man of forward thinking, an innovator who revolutionized the mafia and set the foundations for a new era of organized crime. But time, like it always does, caught up with him. His most trusted allies began to die, either at the hands of rivals or old age. Some too began to question his decisions, particularly his prolonged stay in exile. Though he continued to exert influence over his empire from afar, the physical distance became a barrier he could no longer overcome. His role as a godfather, once unchallenged, now seemed less of a throne and more of a relic of a bygone era. The legal and political pressures that had been building for years were starting to reach their peak. The war on crime, fueled by public outcry and the growing influence of federal law enforcement, began to close in on Luciano. The authorities, led by the persistent efforts of men like Thomas E. Dewey, began to systematically dismantle Luciano's operations. The once untouchable criminal godfather, who had carefully skirted the law for years, was now vulnerable. He had made deals with politicians, lawmen, and businessmen, but these very alliances had started to erode as well. The very people he had worked with were now looking at him with suspicion, wondering whether he had outlived his usefulness. In addition, the rise of new players on the scene, the next generation of mobsters who had learned from Luciano's methods but were more brutal and more ambitious, further weakened his hold. These younger men, such as Carlo Gambino, began to make moves that undermined Luciano's authority. They were more politically astute, more connected, and less willing to accept the status quo. While Luciano had been a master of negotiation and balance, the younger leaders had learned how to wield power with sharper elbows and less hesitation. The final blow came when the U.S. government, under the guise of wartime necessity, began to play a direct role in Luciano's downfall. His ties to Italy, to the Sicilian mafia, and his role in the country's illegal operations became a liability. In a ruthless display of realpolitik, the government, despite his past services, decided that Luciano was a threat that could no longer be ignored. In 1946, Luciano's freedom was stripped away once again, this time in a final, crushing blow to his empire. Deported back to Italy, the man who had once controlled the underworld from the streets of New York was left to watch as his legacy began to fade. No longer a king, but a shadow of the figure he once was, Luciano's fall from power was a sobering reminder of the price of ambition in a world where the rise is often just as dangerous as the fall. Luciano's legacy, despite his downfall, was never truly stolen. It was carried forward by the very men who had once worked under his watchful eye, those who had learned the art of survival in the criminal underworld by observing his every move. While Luciano was no longer physically present to command his empire, his influence remained embedded in the DNA of the mafia. The families that succeeded him, those that had once been under his tutelage, carried the torch with a fierce determination to preserve the power, wealth, and control that Luciano had built. Among those who emerged as Luciano's protégés, Carlo Gambino stood out. Gambino, with his quiet demeanor and strategic mind, was the perfect heir to Luciano's methods. His rise to power within the mafia was a direct reflection of the foundation Luciano had laid down. Gambino understood the delicate balance of crime and legitimacy, just as Luciano had, and was able to navigate the shifting tides of both the criminal and political landscapes. Under his leadership, the Gambino family would rise to dominate New York, becoming the most powerful family in the city. Other men, like Vito Genovese and Joe Bonanno, followed suit, establishing their own empires built upon the same principles that Luciano had pioneered. While they each brought their unique methods to the table, the blueprint Luciano had crafted remained the same. They understood that the mafia was not simply a criminal organization, it was a business. And like any business, it needed to evolve with the times to remain relevant. The older, more established families, like the Genovese and Bonanno families, used Luciano's methods of cooperation, creating a sense of unity in a world where violence and betrayal had once ruled. The commission, which Luciano had created to oversee and resolve disputes between the families, remained intact, albeit with subtle shifts in its power structure. The younger generation, more eager to make their own mark, sometimes clashed with the older guard, but Luciano's legacy of negotiation, order, and control was still evident in the way the families interacted. However, while the families that succeeded him carried his lessons forward, Luciano's personal brand of leadership was difficult to replicate. His charm, his ability to manipulate even the most dangerous of men, was an art form. His focus on business, his understanding that crime could be a legitimate enterprise, was a revolutionary approach that allowed him to build a financial empire that even the law couldn't touch. But by the time his protégés took over, the world of the mafia was changing. The rise of new forces, the constant battle with law enforcement, and the increasing complexity of international crime meant that the old ways, while still effective, were being tested. Luciano's name lived on in the underworld, not just in his protégés but in the myth of the man himself. He became an icon, a symbol of what the mafia could achieve, a legend passed down through the generations. His legacy was not just in the wealth and power he amassed, but in the systems he created and the lives he touched. Even as the world changed, Luciano's influence endured, carried by those who had once served him and the families that would carry on his work for decades to come. The mafia's rebirth after Luciano's fall was not a simple return to old ways, but a reorganization of power, a recalibration of the criminal world he had so meticulously structured. With his absence, many believed the underworld would fracture, that the families would fall into chaos as power struggles consumed them. But instead, the mafia adapted, leveraging the principles Luciano had instilled and creating a more sophisticated, more resilient system. The families that had once followed Luciano's lead, particularly the Gambino, Genovese, and Bonanno families, reasserted themselves, but in a world that had grown far more complex. The commission, which Luciano had masterminded, became more critical than ever. It remained the core of the mafia's unity, a symbol of cooperation amid the constant threat of law enforcement and inter-family rivalries. With no singular leader to command the families, the commission operated as a board of sorts, with each family represented and decisions made collectively. But beneath this collective power, the influence of the older families, those who had worked directly under Luciano, still loomed large. Men like Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese became the new faces of the mafia, their leadership styles shaped by Luciano's methods. Gambino, in particular, was seen as the natural successor, a man who understood the balance of power, who knew when to be subtle and when to exert control. Even in the absence of Luciano's commanding presence, his influence was felt everywhere. His ability to merge the world of crime with legitimate business was adopted by the new generation, who continued to launder money, hide assets, and invest in businesses that offered both wealth and cover. The streets may have been quieter, but the money kept flowing, and the power structures remained largely intact. The businesses Luciano had established became stronger, a testament to the empire he had built. The heroin trade, the labor unions, and the various rackets Luciano had cultivated were no longer just the domain of the families. They had become entrenched in the fabric of American society. The mafia's rebirth was not just about maintaining its criminal activities, it was about adapting to a changing world. Law enforcement had become more aggressive, the government more determined, but the underworld found new ways to thrive. The families began diversifying, finding new ways to avoid detection and increase profits. Organized crime had grown into a global enterprise, one that Luciano had foresaw and crafted for. His fingerprints were all over the new methods, even as his name had faded from public view. As the years passed, the mafia's rebirth was solidified, but it was a different world now. The harshness of the old days, where power was maintained by bullets and intimidation, had given way to a more subtle form of control. Luciano's vision had shaped this transformation. He had understood that to survive in the long term, the mafia would have to change, would have to evolve. And as the mafia's rebirth unfolded, it was clear that Luciano's spirit, the man who had once ruled the underworld, was still very much alive in the operations, the alliances, and the power structures that continued to thrive in the shadows. Luciano's influence didn't fade with the passing years. It echoed through the generations of criminals that followed him. Even after his deportation, the old guard, men who had learned the ropes under his watchful eye, carried his principles with them. His empire may have crumbled, but his legacy was like the slow burn of an old flame, kept alive by those who revered him and his methods. The mafia of the post-Luciano era did not forget the lessons of their mentor. Instead, they adapted them to the new realities of crime, embedding his strategies deep into the bones of organized crime. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the mafia had shifted from its old-school, brute force style of operation to a more strategic and corporate model. Luciano's ideas about discipline, loyalty, and business practices set the framework for how organized crime would operate for decades to come. His creation of the Commission as a governing body for all the families remained a powerful tool, even in a time when new criminal leaders had to contend with growing law enforcement and increasing media scrutiny. But more than that, his understanding of the broader scope of crime, his ability to cross boundaries between the underworld and legitimate businesses, became a blueprint for the next generation of mobsters. They no longer just ran rackets, they ran corporations, casinos, trucking companies, and even legitimate investments in real estate and hotels. Luciano's old friends, those who had once sat at his table, now found themselves teaching the younger generation the subtle art of control. Men like Vito Genovese's successors, the Gambinos, and others, shaped their leadership in Luciano's mold. But what was striking about this new generation of criminals was their sophistication. They didn't rely on muscle or intimidation alone, but on persuasion, manipulation, and, most importantly, the connections that Luciano had valued so highly. He had shown them that true power didn't come from ruling with an iron fist. It came from operating behind the scenes, from controlling things in the shadows, and from moving in a way that allowed them to stay one step ahead. While Luciano's direct involvement with the mafia faded, his methods permeated through the ranks. The idea of loyalty to the family, the importance of maintaining business with a low profile, and the ability to strike deals with politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officials, these lessons became the cornerstone of the new mafia. Even as organized crime began to diversify into areas like drug trafficking and money laundering, Luciano's fingerprints were evident in how the new bosses maneuvered. He had always believed in controlling the narrative, in being present in the right rooms, and ensuring that even in his absence, the mafia would continue to thrive. And thrive it did. shaped by the indelible mark he had left on the underworld. By the time of his death, the Mafia had become a transnational enterprise, and while the world was changing, Luciano's influence ensured that the old guard, through their adaptation of his strategies, would remain a key force in organized crime. His presence, like an invisible hand, guided them even as they moved forward into new avenues, continuing to build the empire he had laid the foundation for. The final years of Charles "Lucky" Luciano's life were a quiet reflection of the tumultuous legacy he had built. He had been exiled to Italy, far from the streets of New York that he had once ruled with an iron fist. His health, once resilient and strong, began to decline in the early 1960s. The years of stress, the battles, the betrayals, and the lifestyle of constant scheming had taken their toll on his body. Despite his achievements, despite his reign, he was no longer the powerful figure that once sat at the pinnacle of the criminal empire. The once sharp mind that had outmaneuvered countless rivals was now clouded by the realities of age and sickness. Luciano spent his final years in Italy, a place where he had no direct control over his former empire. Yet, even in exile, he remained a figure of great influence. His name was still whispered in the backrooms of the Mafia. His former associates, those who owed their rise to his mentorship and power, still revered him as the godfather of the modern organized crime family. But the world he had known was changing. The Mafia was no longer what it once had been, and Luciano's ability to control it from overseas had become more of a memory than a reality. Despite his frail health, Luciano was not entirely disconnected from the world of crime. His influence still stretched across the Atlantic, as his protégés and the families he had helped to structure carried on his legacy. But he was no longer the dominant force he had once been. The Mafia had evolved into a more complex and diversified system, one that no longer needed the same kind of brute force tactics that had made Luciano famous. Yet, his blueprint for success remained embedded in its core. Luciano's final days were a quiet descent into obscurity, but his legacy was still alive. He had transformed the landscape of organized crime, establishing a structure that would outlive him. The families and syndicates that followed were the products of his vision, and though he was no longer at the helm, the principles he instilled in them continued to guide their actions. But for all his brilliance, all his power, Luciano was just a man, vulnerable to the same frailties that claimed so many before him. On January 26, 1962, Luciano passed away from a heart attack at the age of 64, a death that seemed almost anticlimactic considering the life he had lived. For a man who had once controlled the destinies of entire criminal empires, his death seemed almost too simple, too ordinary. But that, in many ways, was fitting. The world of crime, as Luciano had known it, had shifted, and his death marked the end of an era. His reign had given way to the next generation, and his influence, though still felt in the underworld, had faded into the annals of history. Luciano's legacy, however, lived on in the criminal world he had helped shape. The commission, the alliances, the business model, all of it endured long after he was gone. But his final days were a stark reminder that, in the end, even the most powerful men must yield to time. After Lucky Luciano's death, the Luciano family's grip on the Mafia, once formidable and unyielding, began to weaken. His passing marked the end of an era, but it also ushered in a period of uncertainty for the family that bore his name. Luciano had been the architect of the modern Mafia, crafting a system that balanced power with sophistication. But in his absence, the structure he had built began to fracture. His immediate successors, his lieutenants and close allies, found themselves struggling to maintain the influence Luciano had once wielded so effortlessly. The family, though still influential, was no longer the dominant force it had been in the days of Luciano's reign. His closest associates, including the likes of Vito Genovese, who had once been a key part of Luciano's rise, now fought for control. The internal power struggle within the family was inevitable. Generational divides also played a part in the weakening of their position. Younger members of the mafia, raised in a changing world, began to prioritize different methods of doing business, some of them more violent, others more involved in legitimate enterprises. The old methods, while still effective, were no longer as viable in a world that was evolving rapidly. Despite the challenges, the Luciano family continued to hold power within the mafia, though their role had been diminished. The organization had splintered into smaller factions, each one vying for a piece of the lucrative criminal pie that Luciano had once controlled. The commission, which had been established under Luciano's leadership to ensure order among the crime families, began to lose its effectiveness. With Luciano gone, no one had the same commanding authority, and power became more decentralized. The rise of new, more aggressive families, including the Gambino and Colombo families, threatened the once unchallenged influence of the Lucianos. Yet, the Luciano name still held weight in the mafia world. Though their reign was no longer as absolute, the family's legacy continued to cast a long shadow over the streets of New York and beyond. Members of the family, while struggling to keep the empire intact, still retained significant power within certain territories. They were not as dominant as they had once been, but they were far from irrelevant. However, the Luciano family's struggle to maintain control was not only a matter of internal conflict. The external pressures were mounting. Law enforcement, which had been under the command of figures like Thomas Dewey during Luciano's reign, continued to ramp up its efforts to dismantle the mafia. Investigations into organized crime were relentless, and without Luciano's charismatic leadership, the family found itself vulnerable to new tactics and pressures from both the police and rival families. By the 1970s, the Luciano family had transformed from the powerhouse it had once been to a diminished entity, though still influential in the shadows. The legacy of Lucky Luciano, for all its flaws and violence, would always be remembered as the foundation on which the modern mafia was built. His family, now struggling to navigate a new world without his guidance, would forever bear the weight of his name, even as they fought to maintain their place in a changing criminal landscape. Lucky Luciano's innovations in organized crime went far beyond the streets of New York and the confines of the mafia. His genius lay not just in his ability to organize and lead, but in how he transformed crime into a well-oiled, highly strategic business operation. He recognized early on that the fragmented, chaotic nature of the mafia, with its constant infighting and disorganization, would eventually lead to its downfall. So, he reinvented it, creating a system where power was consolidated, profits were maximized, and competition was strategically minimized. Luciano's establishment of the Commission in the 1930s marked the beginning of this transformation. The Commission was a groundbreaking idea, bringing together the heads of the 5 families in New York, along with other powerful crime families, to settle disputes, divide territory, and organize criminal activities without resorting to violence. This innovation created a level of stability within organized crime that had never been seen before. By creating a governing body that operated with rules and a hierarchy, Luciano was able to shift the mafia from a loose confederation of gangs into a structured, business-minded syndicate that rivaled legitimate corporations in its efficiency. Luciano also understood the power of diversification. He knew that relying solely on traditional criminal activities like extortion, loan sharking, and gambling would eventually leave the organization vulnerable. So, he expanded into labor unions, waterfronts, and, perhaps most famously, the drug trade. His early control of heroin trafficking set a precedent for the mafia's ability to infiltrate other illicit industries, from pornography to arms dealing. By finding new avenues for profit, Luciano ensured the mafia's financial growth and dominance, transforming it into a multi-million-dollar global enterprise. Beyond these structural and business innovations, Luciano's impact on the criminal landscape extended to law enforcement and politics. He recognized that influence and power were not solely limited to the criminal world. By cultivating relationships with politicians, police officers, and even government officials, he blurred the lines between legality and illegality. His ability to control not just the mafia, but also the machinery that fought against it, ensured his long-lasting legacy. Luciano's connections helped shield him from law enforcement, even when his activities were under intense scrutiny. The impact of Luciano's reforms rippled through not just the mafia, but organized crime worldwide. His methods became the model for other criminal organizations, from the infamous Italian mafia families to the drug cartels in Latin America. Luciano's vision for a professionalized crime syndicate influenced how these groups were run. By operating like a corporation, these organizations grew exponentially, securing power in ways that had been unimaginable before. Luciano's legacy was not just about the wealth he amassed or the territory he controlled, but about how he changed the entire structure of organized crime, making it a global and enduring force. The price of Luciano's power was a heavy toll, one that reached far beyond the criminal empire he built. As he rose through the ranks of organized crime, his ambition and ruthlessness shaped every decision he made, but the personal cost was undeniable. At the height of his power, Luciano had everything: wealth, influence, and the loyalty of some of the most feared men in the world. Yet, beneath the surface of his empire, a web of betrayal, isolation, and sacrifice quietly took hold. Luciano's relationships were, by necessity, transactional. Every connection, whether with family, friends, or allies, was forged through loyalty, but also under the looming threat of danger. His ability to maintain control over his empire came at the expense of genuine human connection. Many of those closest to him, including his own family, were drawn into a world where loyalty to him meant subjugating their own desires and needs. His personal life, particularly with his wife and children, became strained. The constant danger he faced, coupled with the demands of running a global criminal syndicate, created an unbridgeable divide between him and those who should have been closest to him. Luciano's control over his crime family came with its own sacrifices. He had to turn against former friends, trusted allies, and even some of his own men when their loyalty faltered or they threatened his dominance. His success depended on a series of brutal decisions that left bodies in his wake, including those of people he had once considered family. The violence that surrounded him became a necessary evil, and the constant threat of betrayal and assassination left him in a perpetual state of paranoia. The weight of Luciano's power also affected those who worked under him. The mafia, under his leadership, became more than just a criminal enterprise. It became a family bound by fear and respect. But that bond was fragile, as power struggles, rivalries, and betrayals festered beneath the surface. Luciano's own men, the people he trusted the most, were often forced to make decisions that would cost them dearly. Those who crossed him or failed him were eliminated without hesitation, leaving a trail of broken relationships and shattered loyalties. Even as he reached the pinnacle of his influence, Luciano's life became a paradox. His empire thrived on control, secrecy, and fear, but the very nature of his power isolated him from the world around him. The more he expanded his reach, the more vulnerable he became to the very people he relied on. His personal connections were either strained or manipulated to maintain his grip on power, and those who were once close to him found themselves caught in a dangerous game where survival meant sacrificing their integrity. The cost of Luciano's power was not only paid in money or lives, but in the erosion of his humanity. His world became one of shadows and secrets, where every move was calculated and every trust was conditional. The price of the empire he built was not just measured in dollars, but in the fractured pieces of his personal life and the lives of those around him. Luciano's genius wasn't just in building an empire, but in his uncanny ability to maintain order within the chaos that surrounded him. In the criminal world, where violence, betrayal, and greed ran rampant, he stood as a pillar of control, managing an intricate web of operations across the U.S. His rise wasn't due to brute force alone, but to a mastery of organization and strategy. In a world where the line between loyalty and treachery was often razor-thin, Luciano crafted a delicate balance that kept his empire stable. From the start, he recognized that the true key to power was not only muscle, but structure. While others built their influence through fear and brute force, Luciano made sure his operations were professional, efficient, and far-reaching. He understood the importance of organization, turning the mafia into a business where each operation had its own leader, and each was accountable to him. His ability to assign clear roles to each member of his syndicate ensured that everyone knew their place. This hierarchy gave his empire an unusual stability for a criminal organization. Even more crucial was his ability to manage and control conflict. Where others saw disputes as the foundation for war, Luciano viewed them as opportunities for negotiation and resolution. His infamous creation of the Commission, a board to arbitrate disputes among the major families, was a masterstroke in maintaining control. By putting in place a neutral system to resolve conflicts, Luciano avoided the kind of destructive turf wars that had previously torn the mafia apart. This strategy allowed him to keep the peace among his allies, while cementing his position as the ultimate power broker. However, Luciano wasn't above using force when necessary. He knew when to make brutal decisions and when to let others fight their battles. The world around him was volatile, full of shifting loyalties and violent confrontations, but he maintained a calm, almost detached demeanor. He kept his emotions in check, never letting anger or ego cloud his judgment. Luciano's ability to separate himself from the chaos, to step back and view each situation from a distance, was one of the reasons his empire thrived while others crumbled. In the face of escalating law enforcement pressure, rival gang conflicts, and shifting political landscapes, Luciano remained unshaken. His ability to adapt, to reorganize, and rethink his strategies kept him steps ahead of those who sought to dethrone him. He saw his empire not as a castle built on sand, but as a machine with moving parts, each one vital to the greater whole. This foresight in leadership allowed him to shift with the times, remaining relevant and powerful, even as the criminal world around him changed. Luciano's reign was one of calculated moves, not just violent conquest. He controlled chaos, not through fear alone, but through order, structure, and an unwavering understanding of human nature. In a world where unpredictability was the norm, Luciano's ability to maintain a steady hand was what allowed him to thrive. Lucky Luciano was more than just a gangster. He was a revolutionary who forever changed the landscape of organized crime. Before him, the mafia was chaotic, disjointed, and often defined by its reliance on brute force and intimidation. Luciano saw a different path, one where crime could be treated like any other business, with structure, efficiency, and calculated risk. He understood that in a world where power was often fleeting and alliances were fragile, only one thing could provide long-term stability: professionalism. At the core of Luciano's transformation of organized crime was his ability to treat the mafia not as a series of isolated groups, but as a network. He recognized that the fragmented nature of the underworld was a weakness, and he knew how to fix it. By organizing the major families into a system with centralized leadership and shared goals, he forged a business-like structure that allowed each faction to thrive while remaining loyal to a central command. This was the beginning of the Commission, a decision-making body that would arbitrate disputes and set the rules for how criminal enterprises were to operate. Where others relied on personal loyalty and fear, Luciano turned to strategy and rationality. He understood the importance of cooperation, even among rivals. By establishing clear lines of authority and creating mechanisms for negotiation, he eliminated much of the violence that plagued the mafia in the past. Luciano's vision of organized crime as a business wasn't just about making money. It was about maintaining stability, creating partnerships, and eliminating unnecessary bloodshed. In his world, loyalty was not just an emotional bond, it was a professional contract, one that could be broken if it didn't align with the best interests of the organization. Luciano also pioneered the use of legitimate businesses as fronts for criminal operations. By integrating his illegal ventures with legitimate enterprises, he was able to launder money, gain influence, and reduce the risk of law enforcement interference. His understanding of how to move money, manipulate markets, and leverage public figures was unmatched. The mafia was no longer confined to alleyways and shady bars. It had infiltrated mainstream society, pulling the strings from behind the scenes in ways that were both sophisticated and insidious. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano redefined the public perception of organized crime. Before him, gangsters were seen as untouchable thugs, glorified in folklore but feared by society. Luciano, however, made crime look like business, a world where the ruthless decisions were made with cold calculation rather than fiery passion. He built a criminal empire that operated like a corporation, with workers and bosses alike taking pride in their roles. He turned the mafia into a powerful entity that could go toe-to-toe with the most influential businessmen and politicians of the time. And he did it with a calm demeanor and a sharp mind that set him apart from the chaotic violence of his predecessors. In doing so, Luciano didn't just change the way crime was viewed, he made it a force to be reckoned with, reshaping the very fabric of organized crime itself. Luciano's impact on the mafia was not limited to his immediate reforms. He was the architect of an evolving empire, one that adapted to the times and the changing world around it. Before his influence, the mafia was a patchwork of independent gangs, each with its own rules, hierarchies, and territories. The lack of coordination and constant feuding between families made it difficult to maintain order, and the mafia's operations were more erratic than systematic. Luciano saw this chaos as a vulnerability and decided to transform it into something far more sophisticated, laying the groundwork for the mafia's future. The Commission was perhaps his greatest legacy, a governing body that centralized authority within the mafia. By creating a formal structure, Luciano not only brought order to the underworld, but also gave the mafia the ability to make decisions as a unified entity. This was revolutionary. No longer would criminal families engage in endless turf wars or random acts of violence. Instead, disputes would be resolved with deliberation and consensus, and the focus would shift from infighting to maximizing profits. With the Commission in place, Luciano turned his attention to more complex aspects of crime, particularly the integration of legitimate businesses into the mafia's operations. While other gangsters relied on traditional rackets like extortion and gambling, Luciano understood that power and wealth came from being able to move freely within mainstream society. He made sure the mafia had a stake in every aspect of the economy, from docks to restaurants, from garment businesses to construction. This was a subtle form of control, one that allowed the mafia to launder money, avoid scrutiny, and maintain an image of respectability while continuing its illicit activities. As time passed, Luciano's influence continued to grow, and his ability to adapt to new circumstances kept him on top. During Prohibition, for example, he saw the rise of bootlegging as an opportunity, and his operations made the mafia an essential part of the alcohol trade. But Luciano's vision wasn't limited to alcohol. He expanded the mafia's reach into a wide range of criminal activities, from narcotics to labor racketeering, creating an empire that was both versatile and resilient. His ability to evolve the mafia also extended to his dealings with law enforcement and politicians. While others tried to keep their criminal dealings hidden, Luciano knew that power in the modern world came from connections. He was unafraid to work with, manipulate, or outwit those in power, always keeping the mafia's best interests at heart. His relationships with political figures and law enforcement agencies were transactional. He would give them something they wanted in exchange for protection or favors, using his vast network of contacts to further the mafia's objectives. Even in exile, Luciano's influence remained palpable, especially as younger generations of mobsters looked to him as the ideal model for success. His vision of a unified, business-minded mafia persisted long after his time, continuing to shape organized crime for decades. In the end, Luciano didn't just change the mafia, he built a legacy that would endure long after his death, ensuring that the criminal empire he founded would continue to evolve and thrive. Luciano's relationship with the FBI was one defined by a cat-and-mouse game that stretched over years, filled with tactics, evasion, and calculated risk. From the moment he rose to prominence in the early 1930s, the authorities knew they had a problem on their hands. Luciano wasn't just a gangster, he was a mastermind, and the scope of his criminal empire threatened the very fabric of law enforcement. But for all their resources and manpower, the FBI never seemed able to land a direct blow on him. One of Luciano's greatest talents was his ability to stay out of sight, to operate under the radar. He understood the importance of distance, both physically and politically, from the crime scenes that could expose him. While many in the mafia relied on brute force, Luciano's power lay in his intelligence and his ability to play the system. He surrounded himself with loyal men, each capable of handling different aspects of the empire without ever drawing attention to their leader. This network kept him out of the spotlight, giving him the ability to pull strings without ever being caught in the act. The FBI's attempts to bring him down were often thwarted by this. Their surveillance operations were frequent, but Luciano was a ghost. Whether it was switching locations, constantly rotating his vehicles, or using an intricate network of intermediaries to conduct business, Luciano knew how to frustrate their efforts. He also understood the value of legal businesses, ensuring that much of his wealth was channeled through legitimate fronts. This layer of respectability made it difficult for the FBI to build a case based solely on the information they gathered. The mafia was no longer just a street gang, it was a global network that could operate in plain sight and still remain undetected. Despite their efforts, the FBI never truly got a firm hold on Luciano's operations. His extensive knowledge of law enforcement methods and his ability to adapt kept him several steps ahead. He was always 2 moves ahead, making sure to control his own narrative and public perception. His public demeanor was that of a businessman, smooth and calculated, never overtly dangerous in the eyes of those outside the criminal world. Even when arrested in 1936, Luciano's true power wasn't immediately apparent. The government's case against him was built on relatively weak charges, a testament to how well he had hidden his tracks. Yet, Luciano's luck couldn't last forever. The government was eventually able to secure his conviction for prostitution-related charges, a crime that, at the time, was hard to disguise. This became one of the few instances where the FBI successfully captured him, and even then, it wasn't the result of a traditional investigation. His conviction led to his deportation to Italy in 1946. But even from there, Luciano's influence lingered. The FBI had captured the man, but his empire, well constructed and global in reach, continued to hum along, beyond the reach of their grasp. Luciano's rise to power wasn't simply a matter of brute force. It was a testament to his exceptional ability to forge strategic alliances, particularly in the realms of politics and finance. From the moment he began his ascent in the underworld, Luciano understood that to truly expand his empire, he needed more than just muscle. He needed access to the right people, those who could help him navigate the corridors of power and influence the systems that governed the country. One of the key elements of Luciano's success was his relationship with politicians. While many gangsters kept their distance from the political world, Luciano made it his business to be involved. He knew that politicians were often the gatekeepers of power, and gaining their favor could provide him with protection and, more importantly, legitimacy. He didn't just pay them off, he cultivated relationships. Luciano was a master of using favors, patronage, and even blackmail to secure the loyalty of city officials, judges, and law enforcement. His political connections gave him a level of security that most criminals could only dream of, allowing him to operate without constant fear of law enforcement interference. In addition to politicians, Luciano also built connections with the financial world. He recognized early on that to truly solidify his power, he needed to create a financial empire that could support his criminal activities. He used his influence to gain control over various legitimate businesses, including shipping, construction, and gambling, all of which provided him with a steady stream of income. These ventures were not just a cover for his illicit activities. They were essential to maintaining his empire. Luciano's ability to launder money through legitimate channels gave him the financial stability to reinvest in his criminal network. Expanding his reach further into the legitimate world, Luciano also formed ties with other organized crime families across the United States. While traditional mafia families operated on a more insular basis, Luciano sought to unify the various factions of the underworld, creating a more cohesive and cooperative system. His work in establishing the Commission, a governing body that settled disputes between mafia families, solidified his role as the de facto leader of the American mafia. Through this centralized structure, Luciano not only prevented infighting but also ensured that the entire mafia apparatus worked together to maximize profits. This alliance building extended to other crime syndicates, including connections with Italian crime families in Sicily, ensuring that Luciano's influence was felt not just in New York but across the world. By aligning himself with powerful figures in politics, business, and other crime families, Luciano created a network of allies who helped him expand his criminal empire to unprecedented heights. His strategic alliances gave him the leverage he needed to operate without the constant threat of being taken down by law enforcement. In many ways, Luciano's success wasn't just due to his criminal ingenuity, but his ability to navigate and manipulate the complex web of power that spanned beyond the underworld. Luciano was not just a criminal mastermind, he was a mentor, a teacher to those who followed in his footsteps. His empire wasn't built on mere violence and intimidation, though that played a part. It was the lessons he imparted, both overt and subtle, that allowed him to maintain power and leave an indelible mark on the criminal world. One of the most important lessons Luciano taught was the art of leadership. He understood that power wasn't just about strength, it was about influence, the ability to lead with authority and vision. Luciano knew how to command respect without demanding it. He wasn't the kind of boss who made his presence known through brute force alone. Instead, he led by example, setting the tone for the entire organization. His leadership style was based on loyalty, and he understood that true loyalty could only be earned through respect. He made it clear that while loyalty to the organization was paramount, respect for those under him was just as important. It was this balance that created a sense of unity within his ranks, allowing the mafia to function with a cohesion that few other organizations could match. Another key lesson Luciano taught was the importance of manipulation, both subtle and strategic. He understood human nature in a way that allowed him to exploit the weaknesses and desires of others. Luciano knew that people could be easily swayed with the right incentives, whether it was money, power, or fear. He used this knowledge to build alliances, sway politicians, and gain influence over law enforcement. He didn't simply rely on brute force to achieve his goals. He was a master manipulator, able to twist situations in his favor without drawing attention to his methods. His ability to play people against one another, to keep his enemies guessing, was a testament to his skill as a strategist. Luciano's strategy was built on patience and timing. He taught his followers that success in the criminal world, as in any other, wasn't about immediate gratification. It was about waiting for the right moment to strike, for the opportune time to make a deal or take down a rival. He knew that while power could be seized quickly, it could just as easily be lost. His empire was built on careful planning and an understanding of when to act and when to wait. He also imparted the importance of adaptability. Luciano never became complacent. He constantly adapted his methods and strategies to stay ahead of both law enforcement and rival gangs. He knew that in the volatile world of organized crime, stagnation was death. By being flexible and willing to change, he was able to remain relevant and maintain control, even as the landscape of crime shifted around him. Luciano's lessons were passed down to those who came after him, shaping the future of the mafia. The underworld he built was one of structure and strategy, a reflection of his own understanding of power and influence. His teachings were the blueprint for countless criminals who followed, shaping the next generations of leaders in the criminal world. His legacy was not just in the empire he built, but in the lessons he left behind for those who sought to follow in his footsteps. Luciano's relationships with women were indeed a key part of his complex persona, intertwining power, vulnerability, and strategic alliances. As someone who meticulously constructed his empire, Luciano often found that women were as much a part of his chessboard as the men he dealt with in his criminal operations. His capacity to use relationships as tools of influence reflected his understanding that control wasn't always about force. It could also be about emotional manipulation, societal expectations, and positioning oneself in the right circles. The presence of his wife was, in many ways, a necessity rather than a partnership in the traditional sense. She fulfilled the role society expected, providing the semblance of a perfect family, while Luciano focused on his work, building connections and managing the underworld. Yet, even in her quiet support, she embodied the traditional mafia value of loyalty, a value that Luciano, despite his ever-changing nature, always kept close to him. She wasn't just his wife. She was a symbol of respectability, of legitimacy, even as his empire thrived on violence and corruption. It was Luciano's extramarital affairs that truly revealed his need for power and control. His relationships with other women, often from powerful, influential backgrounds, were more than just romantic entanglements. They were extensions of his empire building. These women, often connected to influential politicians, law enforcement, or business figures, provided him with an unspoken network of influence. His ability to charm and manipulate them gave him access to circles that were usually closed off to men of his background. They weren't just his lovers or companions. They were pieces on his board, individuals who allowed him to expand his reach without having to rely on brute force alone. But within these relationships, there was also a deeper dynamic. Luciano's need for control extended to every aspect of his life, and that included the women with whom he shared intimacy. His interactions with them were a reflection of his broader need to manipulate the world around him, to keep things in motion according to his own will. Even the most passionate of his affairs were often calculated and strategic, with the women he engaged with serving as part of his intricate web of connections. Despite this, some women managed to break through his hard exterior, seeing a side of Luciano that few others would ever understand. These women weren't simply pawns in his game. They were sometimes the ones who could see his vulnerabilities, forcing him to confront his own humanity. They kept him grounded, even when the world around him was in chaos. In those moments, Luciano had to reckon with the man behind the mafia boss, with the parts of him that were not invincible, not controlled, and not untouchable. In the end, Luciano's relationships with women were not just side stories in his life. They were integral to shaping the man he became. They balanced his ruthlessness with glimpses of his vulnerabilities, acting as both tools and challenges in the ever-changing dynamics of his empire. Though he built a criminal dynasty, it was these women who, in subtle and powerful ways, defined a part of his legacy. Luciano's power was not just rooted in what he did, but in what he didn't do. His silence was one of his most potent tools, a weapon wielded with precision and purpose. Where other men shouted orders and used their words to assert dominance, Luciano understood that silence could carry more weight than any threat or promise. He used it to unsettle, to command attention, and to force people to think, question, and react. In a world filled with noise, violence, politics, and constant maneuvering, Luciano stood apart by using the quiet as his most powerful ally. He knew that when silence fell, people listened, and when they listened, they began to second-guess themselves. It was a psychological game, and Luciano was a master of it. In meetings with rivals or allies, he often said little, letting the tension build with every passing second. People would scramble for the next word, each one trying to fill the space he left empty. The longer the silence stretched, the more power he had. It was a way of asserting control without ever raising his voice. In the midst of it, people could feel the weight of his presence. When confronted with a problem or a challenge, Luciano wouldn't always offer a solution immediately. Instead, he'd sit back, observing, letting the conversation unfold around him. His mind was always ticking, processing every word, every gesture, and every shift in tone. By staying quiet, he left others to speak and reveal what they truly thought, what they truly wanted. In those moments, Luciano wasn't just a participant in a conversation. He was the one who was ultimately controlling it. He gave people enough rope to hang themselves, all the while remaining silent, watching how they played the game. His silence was a constant reminder of his authority, the unspoken command that kept everyone around him on edge. People feared the unknown that came with his quiet demeanor. What was he thinking? What would he do next? Was he plotting something, or simply waiting for the right moment to strike? These questions loomed over every conversation, every negotiation, and every power struggle he engaged in. Luciano didn't need to speak to assert his control. The very absence of words spoke volumes. The true power of silence lay in the way Luciano used it to manipulate not just people's actions, but their thoughts. His silence was an invitation to fill the void with uncertainty, to act with caution, and to give him the advantage. In his world, where so much was driven by bravado, Luciano's ability to rule with silence became his greatest weapon, a subtle but overwhelming force that few could ever master. When the time came for him to speak, it was always deliberate, always sharp, and always aimed at ensuring his position remained unchallenged. After Luciano's death, the mafia found itself at a crossroads. His empire, once a well-oiled machine under his precise leadership, now faced a period of uncertainty. But the seeds Luciano had planted, his meticulous planning, the alliances he forged, and the infrastructure he created were far from lost. His successors and associates, armed with the lessons of his reign, set about reclaiming the power that had once belonged to him. They knew that the only way to continue Luciano's legacy was to maintain the network of influence he had cultivated, using it to navigate the treacherous waters that followed his passing. Luciano's vision of organized crime had always been strategic, methodical, and far-reaching. His associates, many of whom had been handpicked and groomed by him, understood the blueprint he had laid out. They didn't just see themselves as gangsters, they saw themselves as businessmen, as guardians of a criminal empire that was meant to last. They operated with precision, moving within the same circles of power that Luciano had, maintaining the ties to politicians, law enforcement, and legitimate business leaders that ensured their continued dominance. As the decades passed, Luciano's influence was felt not just in the mafia, but in the broader world of organized crime. His methods turning the underworld into a corporate structure became the standard. Those who came after him adopted his tactics, and with them, they adapted to a changing world. The mafia no longer relied solely on brute force and extortion. It expanded its reach into legitimate industries, infiltrating banking, shipping, and even entertainment. The old ways were mixed with new strategies, ensuring that Luciano's vision for a modern, organized criminal enterprise thrived long after his death. But it wasn't just about maintaining power, it was about the reverence that Luciano's name commanded. He had created an empire that no one dared to topple. The respect he commanded was institutionalized, embedded in the very fabric of the mafia. His legacy wasn't just in the financial wealth he amassed, but in the respect he earned from his associates and rivals alike. It became clear that while he was gone, his presence was still very much felt. The rules, the strategies, the networks he built remained in place, and they were ready to be used by those who carried his torch. In the years that followed, Luciano's name remained synonymous with the mafia's most successful period. He became a legend, and in the minds of those who followed, his legacy was one that would be revered, not just for the power he held, but for the system he built, a system that was not easily dismantled. The reclamation of power was not just a return to old ways. It was a confirmation that Luciano's influence would never truly fade, his legacy embedded in the very core of the mafia that had flourished under his reign. Even decades after his death, the shadow of Lucky Luciano continues to stretch across the world of organized crime. His name, synonymous with the transformation of the mafia, lives on in the principles, strategies, and operations that still define the criminal underworld today. Luciano didn't just build an empire. He created a system, one that not only outlived him but evolved with the times, influencing the very nature of organized crime as it exists in the modern world. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to see beyond the traditional methods of running a criminal organization. He was the architect of the modern mafia, introducing a level of professionalism and structure that set the standard for generations to come. His model of business-like organization where loyalty, discipline, and strategic alliances were just as important as muscle was revolutionary. Today, the criminal underworld operates in much the same way, with sprawling networks that intertwine crime with legitimate business ventures, a direct legacy of Luciano's vision. His influence can be seen in the global reach of organized crime syndicates that now operate across continents. From the cartels in Latin America to the triads in Asia, Luciano's framework for creating a cross-functional, international crime organization has become the blueprint for modern criminal empires. His focus on securing political influence and controlling key industries remains a tactic used by today's most powerful syndicates. The blending of legitimate businesses with illicit activities, a hallmark of Luciano's reign, is still a cornerstone of the most profitable criminal enterprises in the world. Luciano's legacy also resonates in the way organized crime adapts to new challenges. Just as he navigated the shifting tides of power in the early 20th century, modern criminals have learned to evolve, utilizing technology and global connectivity to enhance their operations. The strategic alliances Luciano forged with politicians, law enforcement, and businessmen are mirrored in today's alliances, where the most successful criminals are those who know how to navigate the complex world of politics and law. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Luciano's influence is the culture he cultivated. The image of the wise and calculating mob boss, who commands respect and operates with cold precision, is one that continues to be romanticized in popular culture. Movies, books, and television shows continue to portray figures modeled after Luciano, perpetuating the idea of the mob as a sophisticated, almost noble enterprise. This image has become ingrained in the public consciousness, ensuring that Luciano's legend lives on in a way that extends far beyond the criminal world. Ultimately, Luciano's legacy is more than just the story of a man who rose from the streets to the top of the mafia. It is the story of how he fundamentally changed the way organized crime operates, and how his ideas, strategies, and persona continue to influence both the underworld and the world at large. The principles he set in motion continue to guide the most powerful criminal organizations today, ensuring that his influence is felt long after his death.